There is a television show that has been running since before the internet existed, before most of its current audience was born, before anyone thought an animated sitcom could survive more than a single season without being canceled. It has outlasted every competitor, every trend, every cultural shift of the last 4 decades. It has survived the death of Saturday morning cartoons, the rise of cable, the streaming revolution, and the moment when the internet decided it had overstayed its welcome. And it is still here. Most people think they know The Simpsons. They know the yellow skin and the four fingers and the opening credits. They know the couch gag and the chalkboard and Bart saying his catchphrase. They know the episodes everyone talks about, the ones that got quoted and memed and dissected until every frame had been analyzed to dust. But there is a version of The Simpsons that almost nobody knows. A version made up of the decisions that happened before the cameras rolled, in writers' rooms and recording booths and executive offices and animation studios scattered across 2 countries. A version made up of the things that got cut, the things that got changed, the things that were buried in production documents and DVD commentaries and interviews that never went viral. A version made up of the strange, the surprising, the genuinely unsettling facts that have been sitting in plain sight for 36 years while everyone was busy watching the show. That is what this is. 4 hours of it. Get comfortable, because none of it is going to be what you expect, and some of it is going to make you see a show you thought you already understood in a way that is genuinely new. That is what this is. 4 hours of it. Get comfortable. Section 1. The Simpsons Bible. The secret document that governed Springfield. Every television show that plans to run longer than a single season needs what the industry calls a series Bible. This is the document that defines the show before the show exists. It establishes the world, the rules, the characters, the tone, and the limits of what the writers are allowed to do. It is the foundation that every episode is built on top of. And without one, a show quickly becomes incoherent because every writer brings their own assumptions into the room, and those assumptions do not always agree. The Simpsons has one. Or rather, The Simpsons had one. What that document said, how it shaped the show, and how comprehensively it was eventually abandoned is one of the most illuminating stories in the history of American television. Matt Groening wrote the original pitch for The Simpsons in a waiting room at the Fox network offices in 1987. He was there to pitch a different project entirely, a collection of short animated films based on his Life in Hell comic strip. When he arrived, he was told that if he wanted to use those characters on television, he would have to sign over the rights to them. He had the rights to Life in Hell, and he was not willing to give them up. So sitting in the waiting room, waiting to go into a meeting that was no longer going to go the way he planned, he invented a new family from scratch. He named the parents after his own parents. His father was Homer. His mother was Marge. He named the children Bart, Lisa, and Maggie. Bart was an anagram for brat, which tells you something about how Groening conceived the character in those first few minutes. The whole family arrived fully formed in about half an hour, sketched on paper in a waiting room while the executive he was about to meet was presumably sitting behind a desk somewhere in the same building, unaware that he was about to greenlight one of the longest-running television programs in human history. The pitch worked. Fox approved it. And then the work of actually defining what the show would be began in earnest. The series Bible that emerged from that process was a document unlike most others in television at the time. Groening, along with James L. Brooks and Sam Simon, the 2 men who joined him as executive producers, and who would shape the early years of the show far more than most casual viewers realize, built a document that tried to articulate something genuinely difficult. They were trying to define a show that was supposed to be simultaneously satirical and sincere, a show that could mock the American family while also making the audience genuinely care about a specific American family. That is a harder balance to strike than it sounds, and the Bible was the document that tried to codify it. The first and most important rule in the early document was deceptively simple. The Simpsons were real people. Not real in the sense of being grounded in documentary realism, but real in the sense that their emotions and relationships were to be treated as genuinely mattering. Homer's love for his family was not a punchline. It was the engine. Marge's patience was not a stereotype. It was a character trait with a cost. Bart's rebellion was not just mischief. It was the reasonable response of a child who had been written off by every institution around him. The jokes were supposed to emerge from character and situation, not from the characters being props for gags. This sounds obvious in retrospect because the early seasons of the show feel exactly like this. but at the time it was a radical constraint. Animated shows of that era were not built around emotional authenticity. The Flintstones, the dominant reference point for primetime animation before The Simpsons, was essentially a variety show in animated form. The characters were vessels for gags and celebrity cameos. They did not have interiority. The Simpsons Bible insisted that these characters would. Sam Simon was the person most responsible for translating this philosophical commitment into a practical production system. Simon, who died in 2015 and whose contributions to the show's early years remain genuinely underappreciated, was a showrunner of unusual rigor. He had worked in television long enough to understand that a show's creative identity is determined in the first 2 seasons and then calcifies. If the writers learned bad habits early, those habits would define the show forever. He was obsessive about the rules in the Bible because he understood that once you allow exceptions, you no longer have rules. One of the specific rules that Simon enforced, and that appears in early production documents and has been referenced in numerous interviews with early writers, was what some of the room called the no cutaways rule. This was not an absolute prohibition on non-linear storytelling, but it was a strong preference for stories that unfolded in sequence, in real time, through action and dialogue rather than through digressions. The idea was that every cutaway, every moment where you left the main action to show something funny happening somewhere else, was a small withdrawal from the audience's emotional investment. Do it occasionally and you got a laugh. Do it constantly and the audience stopped caring what happened in the main plot because they had learned that the main plot could be abandoned at any moment. Watch the first 3 seasons of The Simpsons and then watch seasons 10 through 15. The structural difference is stark. The early seasons have a density of plot and character development that the later seasons largely abandoned. Stories build. Consequences accumulate. Characters make decisions that reverberate into subsequent scenes. The show's famous later season habit of letting Homer do something destructive and then simply moving on without resolution was not present in the early years. The Bible would not have allowed it. The document also established something that seems minor, but turned out to be enormous. It defined the economic reality of the Simpson family with unusual specificity. Homer worked at a nuclear power plant. He earned a wage that was described internally as just barely enough. Not poverty, but not comfort. The family lived in a house they could afford only because the house was in Springfield, which was not a desirable location. The car was functional but aging. The food was basic. The vacations, when they happened, were modest. This economic specificity was not incidental. It was the context that made Homer's ambitions readable as legitimate rather than just pathetic. When Homer wants to open a snowplowing business, or start a band, or pitch an invention to a corporation, those ambitions are legible because the show has established that his life has genuine limits, and that he is the kind of person who chafes against those limits. He is not just a fool chasing fantasies. He is a man with real economic anxieties, expressing them through characteristically bad judgment. The Bible made sure the writers understood this distinction. The treatment of religion in the early Bible is particularly interesting given how central it became to the show's identity. The document established that the Simpsons were loosely Protestant, attending the First Church of Springfield, and that their relationship to faith was to be depicted as sincere but complicated. They believed, more or less. They attended church. They prayed. But their beliefs were not idealized. Homer's relationship with God was depicted as contentious, transactional, and occasionally warm in a way that felt genuinely human rather than pious. The Bible specifically warned against using religion as pure satire. The instruction, paraphrased from accounts of the document, was something like, "The audience has religious members, and those members should be able to watch the show's treatment of faith and feel that it takes belief seriously even when it is laughing at the expression of that belief." This is why the show's early religious humor works so differently from what you might expect. It mocks specific expressions of religiosity, specific hypocrisies, specific moments of institutional failure. But it does not mock the underlying impulse to seek meaning, and it does not treat Ned Flanders' faith as inherently ridiculous, even as it puts him through experiences that would test anyone's belief. The character Bible sections are the most fascinating part of the document. Each major character received a detailed breakdown that went far beyond simple descriptors. Homer's section is the longest and most complex. He is described not as stupid but as operating at full capacity within a limited range. The distinction matters enormously. A stupid character is a vehicle for being outsmarted. A character operating at full capacity within limits is a person who is genuinely trying and whose failures are therefore genuinely meaningful. The early Homer succeeds more than he fails, actually. His judgment is poor, but his intentions are good, and occasionally those good intentions produce better outcomes than careful reasoning would have. Marge's section in the Bible is the one that most clearly reflects the era in which it was written and the ways the show's creators were both progressive and constrained by their moment. She is described as the family's emotional center and practical intelligence, the person who holds the structure together through competence rather than just love. But the Bible also acknowledges, explicitly, that her role is one the show needs to examine rather than simply celebrate. The writers were instructed that Marge should not be reduced to a supportive function. She should have her own wants, her own frustrations, her own moments of failure and ambition. The early seasons honor this. Later seasons do not always. Bart's Bible entry is notably short compared to the others, which is interesting given that he was the show's primary marketing vehicle in the early years. The Bart Simpson t-shirts and the "Don't Have a Cowman" merchandise preceded the show's genuine cultural impact by about a season. The Bible describes him as essentially 10 years old and male in the most specific possible sense, meaning he operates according to the social logic of a boy his age, where status among peers matters enormously, where adults are obstacles rather than resources, where rules are arbitrary impositions rather than frameworks for living. His intelligence, the Bible notes, is not academic but operational. He is very good at navigating the specific terrain of childhood, at understanding power dynamics among kids, at social manipulation within his peer group. He is not a good student because school, as it is structured, does not reward the kinds of intelligence he has. Lisa's Bible entry is the one that the writers in the early seasons clearly found most challenging, and the documentation around her character shows the most evidence of revision. The original conception of Lisa was closer to what she eventually became in seasons 2 and 3 than to the character of the first season, where she is somewhat less defined. The Bible describes her as genuinely exceptional, with an IQ and an emotional perceptiveness that are not played for irony. She sees things clearly, she feels things deeply, and the show's obligation, as the Bible puts it, is to take her seriously, to let her be right, to not always give the episode to Homer or Bart at Lisa's expense. The early seasons follow this instruction. The later seasons often do not, and many of the most common criticisms of later-era Lisa episodes come from exactly this failure, the sense that her intelligence has become a trait to be mocked rather than a perspective to be honored. The Bible also established something that took on unexpected significance as the show aged. It defined the relationship between the show's Springfield and the real world as deliberately ambiguous. The writers were instructed to treat Springfield as a real place with real geography and real history, but to never commit to specific claims that would pin the town to a particular state or region. This was a practical decision at the time. A Springfield in Ohio plays differently to an audience in California. A Springfield with a specific political identity might alienate viewers with different politics. The ambiguity was meant to make the show universal. What the Bible's authors could not have anticipated was that this ambiguity would become one of the show's most discussed and debated qualities 3.5 decades later, generating entire theories about why Springfield cannot be located, why its geography is impossible, why the rules of normal American geography simply do not apply within its borders. The instruction to keep the location vague created a mystery that the show never intended to create, and that mystery became part of the show's identity in ways that now feel almost deliberate. There is one more aspect of the original Bible that deserves attention because its absence from the later show is so visible once you know it was there. The document contained explicit instructions about the treatment of Springfield as a community, not just as a backdrop. Other residents were to be developed with care. They were to have their own lives, their own histories, their own interior logic. The show was not supposed to be about a family existing in a world of props and extras. It was supposed to be about a family embedded in a specific community, and that community was supposed to be as real as the family itself. This is why the secondary characters of the early seasons feel so different from those of the later seasons. Barney Gumble has a history and a sadness. Ned Flanders has a psychology. Apu has a life outside the Quickie Mart that the show occasionally explores with genuine interest. Chief Wiggum has a marriage and a son that the show treats as real. The community instruction in the Bible produced a Springfield that felt inhabited rather than decorated. When the Bible's influence waned, when the show outgrew the document and the writers who had internalized it moved on, Springfield became less of a community and more of a stage. The secondary characters became increasingly defined by single traits, the one joke they were there to deliver, the one reaction they were required to have. The living town that the Bible had mandated gradually became a backdrop. Sam Simon left the show after season 4. His departure was acrimonious, the details of which are worth an entire section of their own, and his exit marked the moment when the show's production culture shifted enough that the Bible's influence began to diminish. The document still existed. Writers still had access to it, but the institutional memory of why those rules existed, the people who could explain the reasoning behind each instruction, was no longer present in the room. The Simpsons Bible is not publicly available. It has never been officially published. What we know about it comes from interviews with early writers, DVD commentaries, and the occasional journalist who was granted access to production documents for a profile piece. But its shadow is visible across every episode of the show, in the choices that honored it and in the choices that did not, in the ways the show feels different in its first 4 seasons from every season that followed. The Bible did not just define The Simpsons. It defined what it meant for an animated show to take itself seriously. And the long, complicated, ongoing argument about when the show lost its way is, at its core, an argument about when the show stopped following the rules that the document had established. Drop a comment right now with the time it is where you are and the city or country you are watching from, and subscribe if you have not already. Number, Section 2. The lost episodes scrapped stories that would have changed everything. Television development is a graveyard. For every episode that makes it to air, there are stories that die in the room, scripts that get written and then abandoned, concepts that survive all the way to table reads and then get killed before production begins. Most of those discarded ideas disappear entirely, existing only in the memories of the people who were in the room when they were proposed and eventually rejected. The Simpsons, having run for 36 years with a writer's room that has employed hundreds of people over that span, has a graveyard considerably larger than most. And some of what is buried there would have changed the show so fundamentally that the version of The Simpsons we know today would look almost unrecognizable if those episodes had made it to air. The most documented near miss in the show's history is the episode that would have explained, definitively and in canonical terms, what Homer does during the period of time between when he leaves for work and when he arrives at the power plant. This sounds like a trivial question, but the answer that the writers had developed was not trivial at all. The concept, which was developed during the show's 6th season by a writing team that included several of the most celebrated contributors to the show's so-called Golden Age, proposed that Homer had a secret life. Not a dramatic, conspiratorial secret life, but something more mundane and in many ways more disturbing. Homer, the concept proposed, had developed an alternate routine over years of working the same route to the same job. He had found places along the way where he could stop. A diner where nobody knew him, a park where he could sit for 20 minutes and do nothing, a stretch of road where he regularly got out of the car and walked a quarter mile in the wrong direction before turning around. He was not hiding anything, he was not meeting anyone. He was creating space between his domestic life and his professional life, and he had been doing it for years without telling Marge or anyone else. The episode was supposed to follow Homer on one of these detour days and, in the process, reveal the character's inner life in a way the show had never quite managed. The premise was that Homer's secret routine was his meditation, his way of processing the weight of being exactly who he was, responsible for people he loved, working a job he found meaningless, living in a town he had never consciously chosen. The detours were his proof to himself that he still had some autonomy, that some portion of his day belonged to him and nobody else. The episode got through multiple drafts, table reads happened, and then it was killed. Partly because the network was uncomfortable with the idea of Homer having been deceiving Marge for years, even in this minor and ultimately harmless way, and partly because the show's producers felt that making Homer's interior life that explicit would undermine the specific kind of comedy the show had built around his obliviousness. If Homer was secretly processing his anxieties in a park somewhere, he was less funny as a character. He was more human, but less useful to the stories the show wanted to tell. The decision is understandable. It might even have been the right one. But what was discarded was a version of Homer Simpson that would have made the character genuinely tragic in a way that the show has mostly avoided. The Homer who takes secret walks in the wrong direction is a man who knows that something in his life is missing and cannot name what it is. That is a far more interesting Homer than the one who causes chaos because he does not think things through. An equally significant abandoned concept came from the show's 12th season, a period often cited as the beginning of the show's quality decline, but which actually contains more creative ambition than it is given credit for. The concept was a Marge-centric episode that would have followed her through a single weekday while Homer was at work and the children were at school. The episode was conceived as essentially a character study without plot, a meditation on what it meant to be a person whose primary identity was as a support system for other people's lives. What made the concept unusual was that it was not going to resolve into a lesson or a transformation. Marge was not going to discover a passion or confront a problem or learn something that changed her. She was going to spend a day in her house doing the things she did every day, and the audience was going to watch her do them. And the script intended to leave open whether those activities constituted a fulfilling life or an invisible one. The ambiguity was the point. The concept was killed before it reached the stage of a proper table read. The objection was not about quality. Multiple people in the room apparently felt that the concept was genuinely interesting. The objection was structural. An episode of The Simpsons without significant Homer presence was commercially risky. Homer was the audience's entry point. Reducing him to a reference felt like a gamble that the show's ratings at that point could not afford. What makes this story particularly interesting is that the show did eventually make a Marge-centered episode, several of them, but none of them operated the way this concept had intended. The Marge episodes that made it to air gave her plots, gave her transformation arcs, gave her things to do and problems to solve. They treated her as a protagonist in the conventional sense. The abandoned concept had something else in mind, something closer to what the show's Bible had originally mandated when it said that Marge's role was to be examined rather than simply celebrated. The episode that would have done that never got made. There is a whole category of abandoned Simpsons concepts that involves the show's secondary characters getting their own spotlight episodes in ways that the actual show never fully committed to. Chief Wiggum was the subject of a developed concept that would have followed him through an actual criminal investigation, not played for laughs, but constructed as a genuine procedural where the joke was that Wiggum, despite everything, was a legitimately competent investigator when the case required him to be. The irony was supposed to come from the gap between his professional competence and his personal incompetence. At work, in the context of actual detective labor, he was surprisingly good. In every other part of his life, he was an ongoing disaster. The concept got through several drafts and was reportedly close to production before someone in the room made the argument that had killed several other ambitious concepts before it. Making Wiggum actually competent, even in a limited and context-specific way, would change the audience's relationship to him in ways that would be difficult to reverse. The joke about Wiggum is that he is bad at his job. Once you show the audience that he is not always bad at his job, the joke is complicated. The concept was abandoned. The Sideshow Bob problem is one of the show's most discussed creative challenges, but the abandoned stories around Bob are less well known than the episodes that made it to air. Bob appeared in so many episodes over the show's run, and those episodes followed such a rigid formula that the creative team was repeatedly forced to come up with new frameworks that could justify his return without simply repeating the previous story. One developed concept that was abandoned attempted to break the formula in a fundamental way. Instead of another episode about Bob trying and failing to kill Bart, the concept proposed an episode in which Bob succeeded, not killing Bart, but doing the thing he was always promising to do in terms of demonstrating his intellectual superiority and his contempt for the world that had imprisoned him. The episode would have followed Bob as he achieved something genuinely impressive, scientific or artistic or intellectual, something that confirmed everything he had ever claimed about himself. The irony was supposed to be that achieving it made him no happier and no less dangerous. The show was going to argue that Bob's violence was not a means to an end, but an end in itself. That what he actually wanted was not to be recognized as superior, but to make others feel inferior, and that no achievement could satisfy that because the impulse came from damage rather than ambition. This concept apparently got far enough along that voice work was considered, meaning Kelsey Grammer, who voices Bob, was at some point in the loop about it. It was ultimately abandoned because the network was uncomfortable with a Bob episode that did not include the Bart in danger element, which had become the commercial hook of every Bob episode and which audiences expected. The abandoned Sideshow Bob concept is a useful example of a pattern that shows up repeatedly in the history of discarded Simpsons ideas. The most ambitious concepts, the ones that would have genuinely expanded the show's range, were killed not because they were bad but because they were departures. They did not give the audience the version of the show the audience had already decided it wanted. The show's enormous success had created a self-limiting expectation, and the most creative people in the room kept running into that limit. There are documented cases of concepts that were abandoned for reasons that had nothing to do with creative quality and everything to do with external pressure. The most striking involves a proposed episode from the late 1990s that would have examined the Springfield nuclear power plant from the perspective of the workers, not Homer specifically, but the broader workforce. The episode was intended as a labor story, dealing with wages and safety conditions, and the specific experience of working in an industry that the public regards as dangerous, but the workers inside it have learned to treat as ordinary. The concept reportedly got quite far into development before the nuclear energy industry became aware of it. The specifics of how the industry became aware are unclear, but what followed was a period of significant external pressure on the show's production. The nuclear industry had a PR investment in the show's portrayal of nuclear power, or at least in preventing portrayals that they found damaging. The power plant joke in The Simpsons was something they had made a kind of peace with because it was clearly satirical. An episode that engaged seriously with labor conditions at nuclear facilities was something else, something that could be cut up and quoted out of context in a way that the broader satire could not. The episode was not made. What replaced it, in the production schedule where it would have appeared, was a more conventional Homer at work story that did not raise any of the questions the labor concept had been building toward. There is one abandoned concept that deserves mention not because of what it would have said about the characters or the industry, but because of what it reveals about how the show understood itself at a specific moment in its history. During what is commonly regarded as the show's peak period, seasons 4 through 8, the writing team developed a concept that was essentially meta in a way that would have been unusual for the time. The concept proposed an episode in which the Simpson family watched an episode of The Simpsons on television, and that the episode they watched was a real episode of the show, playing within the fiction of the show. The family's reactions to the episode they were watching were going to be the episode's story. Homer was going to be bored by the parts that were really about him, and engaged by the parts he did not recognize as autobiographical. Lisa was going to watch the episode critically, and notice things about the family's portrayal that disturbed her. Bart was going to think the version of himself on television was cooler than he was in real life. The concept was eventually folded into the show's ongoing relationship with self-reference and meta-humor, but the specific episode as it was developed was never made. The reason given in later accounts was that the concept worked much better as a premise than as a full episode, meaning that once the writers started mapping out what would actually happen over 22 minutes, the joke exhausted itself before the story did. But the concept's DNA is visible in several episodes that did get made, in the show's willingness to acknowledge its own fictional nature in controlled doses, as a joke rather than as a premise. The graveyard of abandoned Simpsons episodes is also where you find the show's most politically sensitive discarded material. Several concepts involving specific political figures were developed in enough detail to qualify as genuine stories before being killed by a combination of network concern and legal caution. The show has always engaged with political satire, and the guest star structure means that real people are always potentially in the frame, but there is a significant difference between a satirical caricature and a storyline that puts a specific named person in a specific compromising situation. The concepts that went furthest before being killed tended to involve the show imagining its characters interacting with specific politicians in ways that could be read as defamatory rather than satirical. The line between those two categories is fuzzy, and the show's legal team was apparently quite active in the development of these concepts, recommending changes that would shift a story from one side of the line to the other. Many of those recommendations resulted in the concept being abandoned entirely rather than revised, because the revision removed whatever had made the concept interesting. What the abandoned episode graveyard ultimately reveals is that The Simpsons was a considerably more ambitious show in concept than it was in execution, not because the execution was poor, but because the gap between what the writers wanted to do and what the show's commercial and institutional structure allowed them to do was enormous. The show that made it to air over 36 seasons is remarkable. The show that was left in the room, in draft scripts and table read transcripts and development notes, was something even stranger and more interesting. And unlike the finished episodes, which are available to anyone who wants to watch them, that show exists only as a rumor. Number, Section 3. The voice behind the curtain, hidden performances and casting secrets. The Simpsons has one of the most recognizable voice casts in the history of animation, but the story of how that cast was assembled, how the voices evolved, and what happened in the recording booth over 36 years is far stranger and more complicated than the promotional version of the story suggests. Dan Castellaneta did not originally intend to be Homer's permanent voice. The backstory here is important because it sets up a pattern that repeats across multiple cast members. When The Simpsons was being developed as a series of shorts for The Tracy Ullman Show in 1987, the budget for voice talent was not significant. The plan was to use the actors already employed on The Ullman Show to voice the animated family because those actors were already under contract and their participation in the animation segments would not require additional budget. Castellaneta was one of those actors. He provided Homer's voice as a matter of logistical convenience rather than creative audition. The original Homer voice was different from what it became. Castellaneta has described the early iteration as influenced by Walter Matthau, slow and gravelly and somewhat sardonic, a voice that belonged to a man who was tired in a specific, world-weary way. It is a fascinating counterfactual to imagine. A Homer who sounds like Matthau would have been a very different comic presence. He would have been funnier in some ways, funnier as a voice performance in isolation, but the warmth that makes Homer sympathetic rather than simply abrasive would have been much harder to access through that register. The evolution toward the Homer voice that became famous happened gradually across the Ullman shorts and the first season of the proper series. Castellaneta was workshopping the character in real time, adjusting his instincts based on the material and the direction he was getting in the booth. The key shift, by his own account, came when he moved away from the Matthau influence towards something that felt more genuinely middle American, more mid-range, less stylized. The voice became rounder, more plaintive, more capable of the sudden emotional pivot from frustration to tenderness that became Homer's defining comic and dramatic mode. Nancy Cartwright's audition for Bart is one of the more interesting stories in the casting history because of what she was originally being considered for. She came in for a small role, one of the female students at Springfield Elementary, a character with maybe a handful of lines. She was not being considered for Bart. Bart was expected to be voiced by a young boy, possibly an actual child, in the tradition of animated child characters at the time. Cartwright read the Bart material in the waiting room, made a decision that her agents might reasonably have characterized as professionally risky, and went into the audition performing Bart rather than the character she had been called in for. The producers in the room were initially taken aback and then immediately convinced. Her Bart had qualities that a child performer would have struggled to sustain across a full season of recording sessions. Consistency, comedic timing, the ability to find the emotional reality inside a joke without letting the joke collapse under the weight of feeling. She got the role. What is less known is that Cartwright's original Bart was not identical to the Bart that aired. In the earliest recordings, her performance had more of what she described in interviews as bratty calculation, a quality of genuine scheming that made Bart a more unsympathetic character than he eventually became. The direction she received over the first season moved the performance towards something warmer, more impulsive, less coldly strategic. The Bart who emerged by the end of season 1 was a kid who did things because the impulse overwhelmed his judgment, not a kid who planned his mischief with deliberate malice. The distinction is subtle but significant, and the recorded evidence of the earlier performance exists in the show's earliest shorts, where Bart feels subtly more menacing than the version most people associate with the character. Julie Kavner's Marge is one of the more technically demanding voice performances in animation history, and the reasons why have mostly to do with the physical mechanics of the voice itself. Kavner has a natural vocal quality, a quality that she has described as a kind of perpetual congestion that gives her voice its distinctive sound. The Marge performance builds on this quality and amplifies it, finding a register that expresses both warmth and a kind of contained anxiety, the voice of a woman who is always about to worry about something but is trying, usually successfully, to hold the worry in reserve. The physical cost of sustaining Marge's voice over decades of recording has been a consistent topic in interviews with Kavner. The voice is not her natural register. It requires specific muscular engagement that produces strain over long recording sessions. Early in the show's run, when episodes were recorded in marathon sessions that could last an entire day, Kavner reportedly would lose significant vocal capacity by the end of the session, her voice dropping toward its natural register as the Marge quality became harder to maintain. The production team learned to schedule her most demanding scenes early in the day's recording, when her voice was fresh, and to leave the shorter, lower-intensity exchanges for later, when the performance was harder to sustain at its full characteristic level. The recording process for The Simpsons is structurally unusual compared to most animated shows, and this unusualness has had more influence on the performances than is generally understood. Most animation records its voice tracks first, individually, in separate sessions, and then builds the animation around those performances. The Simpsons does something different. The cast records together, in the same room, as an ensemble. This is not universal across every episode or every era of the show's production, and there have been periods when logistics required more separated recording. But the ideal, the intended method, and the approach used for the most celebrated episodes is the full cast in a single room, performing together, responding to each other's readings, improvising when the spirit moves them, and creating a performance that has the quality of actual human interaction rather than the synchronized but separate quality that you can hear in most animated television. The ensemble recording approach has produced moments that the individual booth approach would never have generated. When Homer's emotional outbursts land with particular force in the early seasons, often it is because Castellaneta was responding in real time to something Kavner did in a previous line that was not in the script but felt right, and his response caught something that a scripted performance could not have anticipated. The booth chemistry between the original cast members was a genuine creative resource, and the show's producers were aware enough of it to build a production system that preserved it. There is a guest star recording history that reveals something important about the show's creative culture. The Simpsons is famous for its celebrity appearances, and the list of people who have provided their own voices for the show reads like a cultural history of the last 36 years. But the experience of those guest stars in the recording process was significantly more variable than the polished result suggests. Some guest stars came in with full preparation, having studied the script, thought carefully about their character's place in the episode, and arrived ready to record. Michael Jackson's appearance in the Season 3 episode Stark Raving Dad, which he recorded under the pseudonym John J. Smith, is documented as one of the most professionally organized guest recording sessions in the show's history. Jackson arrived knowing exactly what he wanted to do and executed it with an efficiency that impressed the production team. The performance, warm and self-deprecating and genuinely funny, reflects the preparation behind it. Other experiences were less smooth. Several documented recording sessions involved guest stars who arrived expecting the session to be essentially ceremonial, a matter of speaking some lines into a microphone while people around them laughed appreciatively, and who were surprised to discover that the show's directors took the voice work seriously and were willing to run takes repeatedly until the performance achieved what the script required. The discomfort was mutual. The show's regular cast, who had been doing this work for years and who understood the specific discipline it required, were sometimes visibly frustrated by sessions with unprepared guests, though accounts suggest the professionalism of the ensemble was such that this frustration was rarely expressed openly. There is one guest appearance in the show's history that has generated sustained discussion in terms of the recording process, which is Stephen Hawking's multiple appearances on the show. Hawking appeared several times, voicing a version of himself, and the logistics of those recordings were genuinely unusual because Hawking communicated through a speech-generating device. The recording sessions with Hawking required the production team to adapt their process entirely, working with his communication technology in ways that no previous guest had required. The results, Hawking playing a satirical version of himself with a comedy sensibility that surprised many viewers, are among the show's most charming guest appearances, and they were achieved through a recording process that was basically unlike anything the production had done before or has done since. The voice credit controversies in the show's history are less discussed than they deserve to be. For the majority of the show's run, the main cast provided essentially all the speaking voices for named characters, but the division of which cast member voiced which secondary characters was not always clear in the early seasons, and resulted in several situations where voice credits were attributed incorrectly or disputed. The Hank Azaria situation is the most significant in the show's recent history, for reasons that extend well beyond technical questions of voice attribution. Azaria voiced Apu Nahasapi Mapatalan for 31 years, from the character's earliest appearances through the show's 28th season. His departure from the role in 2020, following sustained criticism of the character's portrayal of Indian American identity, was one of the most debated developments in the show's history, and continues to generate discussion about the responsibilities of voice casting and the cultural context in which those decisions are made. What is less discussed is the internal production history of the Apu character, the ways in which the character was developed over time within the show's creative process, and the degree to which the criticism of the character's portrayal was or was not apparent to the people making the show over those 3 decades. The available evidence suggests that the concerns that eventually became publicly prominent were present in some form in the production environment significantly before they became public, and that the show's response to those concerns within the production environment was inadequate, a conclusion that several former writers and producers have expressed in interviews over the years since the character's retirement. The ongoing question of the main cast's compensation is another aspect of the voice recording history that reveals something significant about the show's economics and the specific leverage dynamics that develop when a small group of performers are essential to a globally valuable property. By the show's 10th season, the 6 main cast members, Castellaneta, Kavner, Cartwright, Yeardley Smith, Azaria, and Harry Shearer, had become the single most significant bottleneck in the show's production. Fox could, theoretically, continue making The Simpsons with new writers, new producers, new animation directors, new network executives. It could not continue making The Simpsons with a different set of voices for the main characters without destroying the identity that made the property commercially valuable. This leverage produced compensation negotiations that were periodically contentious in ways that leaked into public consciousness. The most significant public standoff came in 2004, when the entire main cast negotiated their contracts as a unified block, refusing to sign individually and presenting Fox with the possibility of the show ending rather than individual actors being picked off. The result was a per-episode rate reported at around $350,000 per cast member, making them among the highest-paid performers in television history at the time. The Harry Shearer saga produced its own version of this dynamic in 2015, when Shearer announced his intention to leave the show, citing contract constraints that he argued would prevent him from pursuing other professional opportunities. Shearer voices an unusually large number of significant characters, including Ned Flanders, Mr. Burns, Principal Skinner, Waylon Smithers, Kent Brockman, and Scratchy from Itchy and Scratchy. The prospect of recasting all those characters simultaneously was, by most industry accounts, genuinely daunting, and the negotiation that followed Shearer's announcement eventually resulted in his return to the show. But the episode revealed the specific vulnerability that comes from having one performer carry so many significant voices. Shearer's departure would not have merely changed some performances. It would have altered the texture of Springfield itself. What the voice recording history of The Simpsons ultimately demonstrates is that the performances the audience hears are not simply the product of talent applied to scripts. They are the product of a specific ensemble chemistry, a specific recording culture, a set of institutional decisions about process and compensation and casting that have evolved over 36 years in ways that are not always visible in the finished episodes. The Homer that Castellaneta performs in the show's most recent seasons is the product of decades of accumulated performance history, of choices made in response to material and direction, and the performances of the people around him. It is the same character and a different character, and a living document of what happens when a performer inhabits a role for an adult lifetime. Number, Section 4. The Writer's Room, Harvard, Chaos, and the Machine that Made Springfield. The mythology around the Simpsons writer's room is one of the entertainment industry's most durable legends, and like most legends, it contains significant truth alongside the simplifications. The true story of how that room worked, who was in it, and how the process of creating episodes actually unfolded is both more interesting and more chaotic than the legend suggests. The Harvard connection is real and significant, but it is also frequently misunderstood. The show did not hire from Harvard systematically or deliberately, in the way that some accounts suggest. What happened was more organic and more interesting. The Harvard Lampoon, the university's long-running humor magazine, had for years produced graduates who found their way into television comedy writing. When the first generation of Simpsons writers was assembled, several of them came from the Lampoon Network. Those writers, once embedded in the show's culture, tended to recommend candidates from the same background when positions opened up. The result, by the show's third and fourth seasons, was a writer's room with an unusually high concentration of Ivy League education, and the specific texture of that education had measurable effects on the show's humor. The Simpsons' humor is notably literary, in a way that distinguishes it from almost every other animated show. References are dense, often buried, assumed rather than explained. The show trusts that some portion of its audience will get the joke and does not pause to verify that trust. Jokes that would have required footnotes in most television contexts are delivered at full speed in The Simpsons, and allowed to land or not, depending on whether the viewer's reference frame happens to include whatever the joke requires. This creates a humor that operates on multiple levels simultaneously, which is the quality that critics and fans have always identified as the show's signature. But it also creates a humor that can be insular and self-congratulatory in ways that were increasingly apparent as the show aged and the writer's room became more homogeneous in its reference points. The physical environment of the writer's room has been described in enough detail across enough interviews and memoirs to reconstruct with reasonable confidence. The room was large enough to accommodate a table where 8 to 12 people could sit, with room for pacing and positioning changes when the energy of the room required movement. The walls were covered in index cards that mapped the structure of the current episode under development and the episodes in various stages of development around it. The visual mapping was functional, not decorative, a way of holding the entire production pipeline in a form that everyone in the room could see at once. The temperature was always cold. This is one of the consistent memories across multiple accounts from multiple generations of writers, and it is not trivial. The cold was deliberate, or at least maintained deliberately, based on a theory that cold temperatures keep people alert and focused in a way that comfortable temperatures do not. Whether the theory was correct is unclear, but the cold is mentioned so consistently in accounts of the room that it appears to have been a genuine constant of the working environment across decades of production. The process of breaking a story in The Simpsons room has been described in enough detail to understand its basic shape, though the specific dynamics varied significantly between different showrunners and different eras. The starting point was always a premise, usually presented in a single sentence. Homer gets a job as a bodyguard. Lisa discovers she has a gift she never knew about. Bart creates a public persona that takes on a life of its own. From that premise, the room's job was to construct a story that could sustain 22 minutes of television. The breaking process, meaning the construction of the story's beat-by-beat structure, was loud and collaborative in a way that could appear chaotic to observers but had its own organic logic. Writers would pitch story directions, often in mid-sentence, often building on or contradicting what the previous person had said, and the showrunner or room captain would track which directions had energy and which were losing the room. Ideas that were clearly wrong were not always stopped immediately. Sometimes a wrong idea needed to be followed for several more pitches before the wrongness became obvious and productive, because the process of following a wrong direction can reveal the shape of the right one. The pitch culture in the room was one of the most commented upon aspects of The Simpsons writing process, particularly by writers who came from other television backgrounds. Many comedy writers develop a thick skin for rejection as a professional necessity, but The Simpsons room in its peak years was described as particularly demanding in this regard. The room moved fast, pitches were evaluated quickly. Writers who spoke slowly or who needed significant setup time before getting to the joke were at a disadvantage in a room where the currency was speed of delivery and precision of result. This culture had consequences that were not entirely positive. Writers who worked in different rhythms, who needed more processing time before speaking, who came from backgrounds that had not trained them in the specific social mechanics of aggressive pitch culture, sometimes struggled in the room even when their individual contributions, when they made them, were excellent. The room optimized for a specific kind of performer, and not every kind of excellent comedy writer is that kind of performer. John Swartzwelder is the most discussed individual writer in Simpsons history and the most mysterious. He wrote 59 episodes of the show over 13 years, more than any other individual writer, before leaving the production in the early 2000s. His episodes are disproportionately represented on every critical list of the show's greatest hours. Homer at the bat, Selma's Choice, Bart Gets an Elephant, The Front, and dozens of others came from his typewriter. Yes, typewriter. Swartzwelder was known among the production staff for actually writing his scripts on a typewriter rather than in the word processing software that everyone else used, and for submitting them in paper form, which required someone to then type them into the production system. He was also known for not attending the writer's room in his later years at the show, a peculiarity that required a specific accommodation in the production process. According to accounts from colleagues, Swartzwelder would write his scripts in isolation and deliver them complete, and the room would then work with the scripts he delivered rather than breaking the stories in his presence. This was possible only because his scripts were good enough to justify the accommodation. A writer producing work of lower quality would not have been permitted to work this way. He stopped appearing at the show's offices entirely in the late 90s, reportedly moving his writing operation to a diner where the booth had apparently become his effective office. When California passed indoor smoking bans that affected the diner, he was said to have purchased the booth itself and relocated it to his home so that he could continue working in the specific physical context he had come to require. This story has the quality of a legend, and it may be one, but it has been repeated often enough by people who worked with Swartzwelder that some version of it appears to be true. His departure from the show is another piece of Simpsons mythology that resists simple explanation. He left without significant public statement, which was consistent with a writing career conducted in almost complete public obscurity. He has given very few interviews and has explicitly declined most requests for them. What is known is that after he left The Simpsons, he began writing a series of comic novels featuring a character named Frank Burley, a detective in what he describes as a comedic noir tradition. The novels have attracted a dedicated readership that is largely drawn from the Simpsons fan community. They are funny in a specific way that is recognizably the same humor as his Simpsons episodes, deadpan and precise and willing to follow an absurd premise to its logical conclusion, no matter how far that takes the story from conventional sense. The showrunner succession at The Simpsons is a subject that matters more than it is usually given credit for, because the show's quality history is inseparable from the succession history. Mike Scully, who ran the show from Season 9 through Season 12, has been the focal point for much of the critical assessment of the period when the show's quality allegedly declined most significantly, and the argument about whether that assessment is fair is one of the more heated ongoing disputes in Simpsons criticism. What is clear from the production record is that Scully's tenure coincided with a significant expansion in the show's audience size, in its cultural visibility, and in the external pressures on its production. The number of episodes per season remained roughly constant, but the number of things the show was being asked to be simultaneously, a flagship for Fox, a vehicle for celebrity appearances, a global brand requiring culturally sensitive adaptation for international markets, a live event in terms of its engagement with current events, increased substantially. Managing those demands while also trying to make good episodes of television is a genuine creative and administrative challenge. And the critical consensus that Scully's showrunner period represents a decline does not always account for the degree to which the conditions of production had changed. Al Jean, who has been the show's showrunner since season 13 and who has held that position longer than any other individual in the show's history, is himself a figure whose legacy is genuinely difficult to assess. His tenure spans from the period critics have generally regarded as post-decline through the show's most recent seasons, and it has included some of the most celebrated individual episodes of the later period alongside some that have generated the most criticism. The consistency of Gene's presence at the top of the production has created a specific kind of institutional stability that earlier showrunner rotations had not provided, but whether that stability has been creatively beneficial or creatively calcifying is a question that different observers answer differently. The writer's room in the Gene era has been described by participants as different in character from the room of the early years, more structured, more hierarchically organized, more focused on process. Whether this represents the natural maturation of a long-running production or a loss of the creative chaos that generated the show's best work is exactly the kind of question that cannot be answered definitively and whose answer depends significantly on which episodes you consider the show's best. What the behind-the-scenes production history ultimately reveals is that The Simpsons is not and has never been the product of a single creative vision. It is the product of an institutional process that has been managed by different people with different sensibilities over 36 years. And the specific character of each era reflects both the creative choices of the people in charge and the institutional context in which those choices were made. The writer's room is where Springfield was built, rebuilt, and occasionally demolished, and the story of that room is as long and complicated and irreducible to simple narrative as the show itself. Number Section 5. The Animation Secrets. What you never noticed in plain sight. The animation of The Simpsons exists in an interesting cultural space, where it is simultaneously one of the most analyzed visual products in television history and one of the least understood in terms of its actual technical construction. Most discussion of the show's animation focuses on the obvious: the character designs, the yellow skin, the four fingers, the distinctive visual shorthand that the show established and has maintained for 36 years. But the actual technical story of how the show's animation was made, how it evolved, and what specific choices were made in its construction is considerably more interesting. The show was animated in South Korea for the majority of its first 25 years, a fact that most casual viewers know but whose implications are not always fully appreciated. The production pipeline for a Simpsons episode in the early seasons was genuinely international in a way that was unusual for American television at the time. Scripts were written in Los Angeles. Voice recordings were made in Los Angeles. The animatic, essentially a rough version of the episode using storyboard drawings synchronized to the voice recording, was prepared in Los Angeles. And then the actual animation, the labor-intensive process of drawing the frames that would make the characters move, was sent to studios in South Korea. This pipeline created a lag that had creative consequences. The production team in Los Angeles would not see the fully animated version of an episode until it came back from Korea, which was typically several months after the animatic had been delivered. By that point, the production team had moved on to other episodes, and returning to make significant changes to the animation was both expensive and logistically complicated. The show learned to be relatively specific in its animatics, leaving less interpretive room for the Korean studios than might otherwise have been ideal, because the cost of corrections was high. The Korean animation teams, primarily at companies called ACOM and Rough Draft Studios, became deeply skilled at the specific requirements of Simpsons animation over years of working on the show. The animators in Korea were not simply executing mechanical instructions. They were making interpretive decisions constantly, choices about how to animate a performance that the voice recording had defined in audio terms but had not specified in visual terms. The specific way Homer's eyes move when he is thinking, the exact physical vocabulary of Bart's confidence or anxiety, the manner in which Marge's posture shifts when she is suppressing emotion, all of these were developed collaboratively between the American creative team's direction and the Korean animators' interpretation of that direction. There is a generation of animation errors in the early seasons that are now classified by fans as charming rather than problematic, but that were originally understood as the inevitable byproduct of this international pipeline. In the first season, inconsistencies in character proportions appear across episodes and even within episodes, because different scenes were animated by different hands in different facilities. Homer's head changes size. The kitchen's dimensions are inconsistent. Characters appear in the background of scenes they have no narrative reason to be in. These are not the results of careless production. They are the results of a pipeline that was still being optimized. The digital transition in Simpsons animation is one of the show's less discussed but most significant technical transformations. For the majority of its run, The Simpsons was produced using traditional cell animation, meaning that individual frames were drawn by hand on transparent plastic sheets called cells, photographed against backgrounds, and assembled into the moving image that appeared on screen. This is the traditional animation process that dominated the industry from its earliest days through the 1990s. The transition to digital production tools happened gradually during the show's 14th and 15th seasons, and it changed the animation's visual character in ways that are visible if you know to look for them. The line work in digital animation has a different quality from cell animation, slightly harder, slightly more consistent, lacking the minor variations that come from hand-drawn work. The colors in the digital era are cleaner and more saturated than the slightly muted palette of the cell era. These differences are subtle enough that casual viewers often do not notice them consciously, but they contribute to the quality that longtime fans describe when they say that the later seasons look different. The background art in The Simpsons is one of the show's most under-discussed creative achievements. The backgrounds of Springfield, the specific visual construction of the town that has appeared consistently across 36 years, required a level of design consistency that is genuinely difficult to maintain over that time span. The power plant needs to look the same in Season 30 as it did in Season 2. The interior of the Simpson house, with its specific spatial arrangements and its specific catalog of objects, needs to be consistent enough that viewers who have been watching for decades do not notice discontinuities. There is an art department document, sometimes called the Springfield Design Bible, that serves as the visual equivalent of the series Bible. It contains specifications for every recurring location in the show, the exact dimensions of the Simpson kitchen, the placement of furniture in the living room, the specific visual elements of the Quick E-Mart's exterior, the layout of Springfield Elementary's hallways. This document, which has been added to and revised over decades, is the reason that Springfield feels like a real place rather than a collection of interchangeable sets. The human characters in The Simpsons exist in a visual relationship with the background art that is more complicated than it might appear. The character designs are highly stylized, existing in what designers call a flat space, where depth and shadow are suggested rather than rendered fully. The backgrounds, by contrast, have considerably more dimensional complexity, more detail, more visual depth than the characters moving in front of them. This tension between the deliberately simplified characters and the more elaborated environments is a design choice that gives the show its specific visual character, the sense that the people of Springfield are slightly less real than the world they inhabit. The color theory behind the show's visual palette is more deliberate than the yellow skin tends to suggest. The yellow was originally a practical choice as much as an aesthetic one. In the early days of television, particularly on NTSC broadcast systems, certain skin tones tended to read inconsistently across different television sets. Yellow was chosen partly because it had a stability across broadcast contexts that other possible skin tones did not. But over time, the yellow became a deliberate identity marker, the visual shorthand for the show's world, distinguishing its residents from guests and from the real world in exactly the way the theories explored elsewhere in this video suggest. The couch gag is an animation production fact that most viewers understand superficially, but whose behind-the-scenes reality is interesting. The couch gag was developed originally as a variable-length segment that could be expanded or contracted depending on how long the actual episode turned out to be. Simpsons episodes do not always come in at exactly the right length. If an episode runs slightly long, the opening credits, including the couch gag, can be shortened. If it runs slightly short, the couch gag can be extended to fill the gap. The gag's creative identity as a site of elaborate animation invention was a later development, one that built on the practical function with genuine creative interest. The evolution of the couch gag from a simple bit of business involving the family and a piece of furniture to an increasingly elaborate sequence that sometimes invites external animators to create entirely different animation styles under. The Simpsons umbrella is one of the more interesting, creative developments in the show's recent history. Couch gags by animation studios such as Pixar, by artists in distinctive individual styles, and by animators working in traditions from different cultures have appeared in recent seasons, making the opening credits one of the show's most genuinely experimental ongoing features. There are specific animation details in the show that function as in-jokes for production staff and attentive fans, a tradition that the show has maintained since its earliest seasons. The pizza boxes visible in the background of various Springfield scenes have consistently used the name Greco Pizza as a homage to a specific Los Angeles pizzeria that was apparently a favorite of early production staff. The number on the power plant's safety violation counter changes between shots in several early episodes in ways that reflect the animator's humor rather than any narrative intention. One of the most elaborately constructed visual jokes in the show's history is so subtle that it requires pause and frame-by-frame review to notice, and it appears in an episode that the production team has never publicly highlighted in this context. In the Season 6 episode And Maggie Makes Three, which deals with the circumstances of Maggie's birth, the show reveals that Homer had photographs of Maggie covering a workplace poster that had previously read, "Don't forget, you're here forever." With the photographs in place, only certain letters of the original message remain visible, spelling "Do it for her." This is an extraordinarily well-constructed visual joke that required the production team to design the photograph placement and the underlying poster text together, in advance, to ensure that the selective obscuring would produce the intended reading. The emotional impact of the visual punchline on first viewing is significant enough that the episode consistently appears on lists of the show's most genuinely affecting moments. The secondary characters of Springfield have visual design histories that are as interesting as their narrative ones. Many of the show's recurring background characters were designed as quick sketches in the show's earliest production period and then found themselves promoted to recurring presences that required more developed visual identities than their original sketches provided. The process of retroactively adding visual consistency to characters who had been designed as throwaways is one of the show's ongoing production challenges. The show's relationship to visual continuity is also worth examining in terms of what it reveals about the production priorities at different periods. The early seasons maintained a relatively high level of visual consistency because the production team was smaller and the communication between different parts of the pipeline was more direct. As the show expanded and the pipeline became more complex, visual inconsistencies became more common, and the show's response to this was to develop better documentation rather than to reduce the complexity of the pipeline. What the animation history ultimately tells you is that the visual world of Springfield is more carefully constructed than it appears, and considerably harder to maintain than a casual viewing suggests. The apparent simplicity of the character designs, which might suggest an easy production process, is in fact one of the more demanding design constraints in television animation, because simplicity requires precision in a way that complexity does not. When you reduce a human figure to the essential geometry of the Simpsons design, every line matters in a way that it would not in a more detailed style. The design has no tolerance for approximation. Number Section 6. The guest star underground. What really happened behind the scenes? The Simpsons has hosted more celebrity guest appearances than any other scripted television show in history. This is not a contested claim. The number is high enough to have become part of the show's identity, and the specific character of those appearances, how they were arranged, what happened during recording, and what the celebrities made of the experience, is one of the richest untold stories in the show's production history. The guest star strategy in the early seasons was genuinely different from what it became. In the first 3 or 4 seasons, guest appearances were relatively rare and were conceived as meaningful narrative events. When a celebrity appeared in a Simpsons episode during that period, their presence was typically embedded in a story that had been written with their specific qualities in mind. The show was not collecting famous names. It was deploying specific people for specific creative purposes. The shift away from this model happened gradually, as the show's cultural status rose high enough that the guest star itself became a selling point, regardless of how the celebrity was deployed. By the mid-1990s, Simpsons guest appearances had become a cultural signifier, a way for celebrities to demonstrate their willingness to be self-deprecating and their awareness of the show's cultural significance. The line of people wanting to appear grew significantly longer, and the show's ability to be selective about its deployments diminished as a result. The most significant single guest appearance in the show's history, in terms of its creative impact and the mystery it created, is Michael Jackson's appearance in the Season 3 episode Stark Raving Dad. Jackson, who was at the time the most famous person on the planet, contacted the show's producers to express his desire to appear. The show agreed, with the understanding that his participation would remain confidential, and Jackson recorded the episode under the pseudonym John J. Smith. The performance itself is warm and generous and genuinely funny, with Jackson voicing a large white man who claims to be Michael Jackson and who helps Bart write a birthday song for Lisa. What makes the appearance unusual is the layers of fabrication surrounding it. Jackson told the show's producers that the character he was voicing was not really him, that he was acting. The producers told Fox that the character was voiced by a sound-alike, not Jackson himself. Fox broadcast the episode, and Jackson maintained afterward that he had only been doing the speaking voice and had used a professional singer for the musical numbers, though this claim was disputed by the production team. The episode was eventually pulled from circulation by Jackson's estate following the documentary that questioned his conduct with minors, a decision that Matt Groening publicly disagreed with. Its removal means that Stark Raving Dad is now one of the few Simpsons episodes that is difficult to access through official channels, giving it a mythological quality that it would not otherwise have. Elizabeth Taylor's involvement with the show is less well known than Jackson's, but in some ways more interesting. Taylor was recruited to provide the voice of Maggie's first spoken word, Daddy, in the episode Lisa's First Word. The choice of Taylor for this specific line was reportedly the result of a conversation about what voice would make the moment feel genuinely significant. Rather than simply funny, Taylor's voice, with its specific quality of warmth and gravitas, was determined to be exactly right for a moment that was supposed to be both comic and touching. Taylor arrived at the recording session having agreed to voice the single word. She recorded it multiple times at the direction of the production team, with different emotional colorings and different rhythms. The session reportedly lasted longer than expected because the production team wanted a specific quality in the delivery, and Taylor was willing to continue experimenting until they found it. The final recording that appears in the episode is, by the account of everyone present, exactly what they wanted, which is not always the outcome. When a celebrity with limited animation recording experience is asked to hit a specific emotional target on a single word. The Paul McCartney episode, Lisa the Vegetarian, is one of the show's most discussed guest appearances because it involved a specific condition that McCartney attached to his participation. He agreed to appear, along with his then-wife Linda McCartney, on the condition that the show would have Lisa remain a vegetarian permanently. The episode would not be a one-off story where Lisa tries vegetarianism and then reverts to meat-eating by the next episode. The change would stick. This was an extraordinary condition for a guest star to impose. Most celebrities who appear on the show have no creative leverage over the episodes they appear in. McCartney's leverage came from the show's desire to have him rather than from any contractual power, and the show agreed to the condition. Lisa Simpson has been a vegetarian in every episode since that appearance, across every season, in every writer's room, for every showrunner. The condition has been honored completely and consistently, making it the most durable creative intervention a guest star has ever made on the show. What is interesting about this intervention, beyond the simple fact of it, is that it demonstrates something about the show's internal culture. When the production team agreed to McCartney's condition, they were accepting a permanent constraint on a character's definition. Lisa could never again casually eat meat without creating a continuity problem. The agreement, once made, became part of the show's institutional memory, something that new writers were told when they arrived, and that was understood as a condition of the character rather than a choice that could be revisited. The show has not always been graceful about guest appearances, and the failures are as instructive as the successes. There are documented cases of celebrities recording their appearances and being dissatisfied with the result, whether because the episode was not as prominent as they had expected, because the character they voiced was treated less generously in the story than they had hoped, or because the recording session itself was not what they had anticipated. Some celebrities have declined invitations to return for second appearances after initial experiences that were less positive than expected. The nature of the production process means that these decisions are rarely discussed publicly because all parties have an interest in maintaining a positive public narrative about the guest star experience. But the production history contains enough indirect evidence of disappointed expectations to suggest that the gap between the idea of appearing on The Simpsons and the reality of the recording session was, for some guests, more significant than they had anticipated. There is a specific category of guest appearance that the show has always handled with particular care, which is the appearance by a person who is directly relevant to a storyline involving real events or real institutions. The most challenging category in this respect has been political figures. The show has hosted numerous politicians, some at the height of their careers and some during periods of political controversy, and the decision-making process around those appearances was always more complex than the show's treatment of celebrity musicians or athletes. The George H.W. Bush storyline from the show's 7th season, which preceded and followed the actual guest appearance by Barbara Bush rather than the president himself, is the most elaborated example of the show's engagement with active political figures. The storyline, which depicted the Bush as neighbors of The Simpsons and explored the cultural clash between the families, was produced during a period when Bush was still a recent former president, and when his public image was clearly defined. Barbara Bush's willingness to appear, in voice form, after having been publicly critical of the show, was a development that required negotiation and that reflected a specific calculation on the Bush's part about the cost of opposition versus the benefit of engagement. The show's treatment of corporate entities as guest star occasions is another category that reveals interesting things about the production culture. The Simpsons has accepted product placement from various corporations over its history, though the show has maintained that such placement is always creative, meaning it is integrated into stories rather than simply inserted, and never purely promotional. The distinction between creative integration and promotional insertion is not always as clear as the show's position suggests, but the cases where the integration has been genuinely creative are visible in the way the commercial element becomes part of the joke rather than existing alongside it. The guest star history ultimately reflects the show's cultural position in a particular way. The Simpsons became famous enough that appearing on it became a form of cultural certification, a signal that you had reached a level of fame significant enough to be satirized by the show that satirizes fame itself. The celebrities who appear on the show are not just providing voice performances. They are participating in a cultural ritual that assigns them a specific kind of cultural significance, the significance of being known enough to matter in Springfield, which has become one of the stranger measures of fame in American entertainment. Number, Section 7. The Merchandise Empire, the Strange, Dark, and Forgotten World of Simpsons Products. There is a version of The Simpsons that exists not on television screens but on store shelves, and in warehouses, and in the back rooms of thrift shops, a material culture that the show generated over 36 years, and that tells a story about American commercial culture that is at least as interesting as any theory about Springfield's radiation levels. The merchandise history of The Simpsons begins before the show was a genuine hit, which is one of the stranger facts in the entire story. Fox moved to license the characters commercially in the first season, before the ratings had established the show as a cultural phenomenon, based on a calculation that the show's edginess and the specific appeal of Bart as an anti-authority figure would translate to a youth market. The calculation turned out to be correct in ways that exceeded anyone's expectations. The Bart Simpson t-shirts of 1990 are among the most documented merchandising phenomena in American retail history. The phrase "don't have a cow, man" appeared on shirts in numbers that the licensing industry still cites as a benchmark. Underachiever and Proud of It caused genuine controversy in school systems across the country, with several districts banning the shirts on the grounds that they promoted values antithetical to academic success. The controversy generated more sales. Schools became advertising. What is less remembered is that the merchandise explosion of the first 2 seasons was so rapid and so large that it outpaced the show's actual cultural consolidation. Products were being manufactured and sold with characters whose personalities were not fully defined on screen yet. The Bart of the 1990 merchandise is sometimes subtly different from the Bart of the television show, more purely rebellious, less complex, because the merchandise was drawing from the marketing concept of the character rather than from the actual performed character that had emerged in the recording booth. There is a specific category of Simpsons merchandise from the early 90s that is now classified by collectors as genuinely bizarre, products that emerged from the licensing process without sufficient creative oversight, and that resulted in objects whose relationship to the show's actual content is difficult to explain. There were Simpsons breakfast cereals. There were Simpsons ice cream bars. There were Simpsons shoes and Simpsons bedding and Simpsons everything in a quantity and variety that reflected not deliberate creative strategy, but the speed of commercial exploitation of a suddenly valuable intellectual property. The cereal is worth a moment's attention because it encapsulates something specific about how the licensing process worked in those early years. The cereal brand produced by a major manufacturer existed independently of any story element from the show. There was no episode about the Simpsons eating cereal. There was no cereal-related joke that the product was building on. The cereal existed because the characters existed, and because the characters were commercially valuable. The product is an artifact of pure commercial extraction, using recognizable faces to sell something that has no other relationship to those faces. This commercial saturation had a specific and somewhat counterintuitive effect on the show's cultural standing. By 1992, the Simpsons merchandise had become so ubiquitous that the brand had temporarily lost some of its edge. The thing that had made Bart's image on a t-shirt exciting in 1990 was its counterculturalism, its slight offensiveness, its quality of being the thing that parents might object to. Once Bart's face was on everything, including children's bedding, the counterculturalism was gone. The rebellion had been absorbed. This is one of the factors that the show's creative team had to navigate in the mid-90s, the reality that the brand had been commercialized past the point of edge while the show itself was still trying to be sharp. The creative response was to pull the show towards something more complex than the simple rebel kid energy that the merchandise had been selling. The seasons of the mid-90s are more emotionally sophisticated, more willing to engage with sentiment, more interested in character depth than the early seasons, and part of that evolution was a deliberate counter-movement against the commercial simplification that the merchandise had been promoting. The Simpsons video game history is its own particular chapter in the merchandise story. The show has generated an unusual number of video game adaptations over its history, beginning with early titles in the 1990s and continuing through to the modern era, and the quality and character of those games reflects the different commercial and creative contexts in which they were produced. The earliest Simpsons games, produced for platforms like the Nintendo Entertainment System and the Sega Genesis, were contractual exercises in the most honest sense. The licenses were sold, game developers were given access to the characters and settings, and the resulting products were judged primarily by their commercial viability rather than their creative relationship to the show. The games of this era are interesting primarily as artifacts of early gaming culture, rather than as Simpsons products. They used the characters' visual identities but had no access to the show's voice cast and no meaningful engagement with the show's narrative world. The arcade game produced by Konami in 1991 is the major exception to this pattern. Konami's Simpsons arcade game, which was a side-scrolling beat-em-up available in arcades across the country throughout the early 90s, used voice recordings from the actual cast, featured hand-drawn animation that replicated the show's style with reasonable fidelity, and constructed a story that, while absurd, was at least internally consistent with the show's universe. The game was genuinely enjoyable to play and captured something of the show's energy in a way that the home console games of the same era did not. It has become one of the more nostalgically valued gaming experiences of the 1990s for people who were children at the time. The major commercial video game from the show's later history, the title simply called The Simpsons Game, released in 2007, is interesting for a different reason. It is one of the few Simpsons merchandise products that was produced with significant creative involvement from the show's actual writing team, meaning that the script for the game, which involved an extensive satirical meta-commentary on video game culture, was written by people who understood the show's voice. The game features the Simpson family becoming aware that they are characters in a video game and exploring the implications of this awareness, which is exactly the kind of meta-humor that the show at its best did well. The game is genuinely funny in places, which is not something you can say about most licensed video game tie-ins. The Simpsons ride at Universal Studios theme parks is another merchandise extension worth examining. The attraction, which replaced the Back to the Future ride at Universal Orlando and Universal Hollywood, is one of the most technically elaborate theme park experiences built around a television property. The show's writers contributed material to the ride's narrative. The regular cast provided voice performances, and the ride's setting, a fictional Krusty-themed amusement park, was developed with enough care to feel consistent with the show's world rather than simply adjacent to it. What the theme park ride reveals about The Simpsons as a commercial property is the degree to which the show's universe had become rich enough to generate entirely new content rather than simply to license existing content. The ride did not adapt an existing episode. It created a new story within the show's world, using the show's characters and voice cast and creative sensibility to build an experience that could only exist in the theme park medium. The distinction matters because it suggests that the Simpsons commercial universe had, by the mid-2000s, become sufficiently detailed and coherent that it could sustain new creative work rather than merely reproducing old creative work in new formats. The most recent major commercial extension of the Simpsons property, the Springfield mobile game developed by Electronic Arts, has had an unusual history. The game, which involves players building and expanding their own version of Springfield, was released in 2012 and has been in continuous operation since, making it one of the longest-running mobile games based on a television property. The game's longevity reflects something interesting about the Simpsons universe's commercial resilience, the idea that people who were raised on the show have a desire not just to watch Springfield but to inhabit it in some active sense, to participate in the construction of the town rather than just observe it. The dark side of The Simpsons merchandise history involves a category of product that the official licensing machine was not responsible for. The counterfeit merchandise that flooded markets in the early 90s, particularly in international markets where licensing enforcement was less rigorous. The bootleg Simpsons products of that era are, from a historical perspective, fascinating artifacts, products that use the characters' visual identities in ways that were genuinely strange, that misunderstood the characters, that combined Simpsons imagery with other cultural references in ways that suggested the bootleggers had at best a secondhand understanding of what they were copying. The most famous category of bootleg Simpsons merchandise is the t-shirts that combined Bart Simpson's image with the cultural iconography of Black American youth culture in the early 90s. Bart as a figure from hip-hop culture, Bart wearing specific athletic gear associated with specific communities, Bart rendered in visual styles drawn from different traditions. These products emerged organically from communities that had adopted the character as a relevant cultural symbol, and that expressed that adoption through the same channels they used to express other cultural affiliations. The official licensing machine did not produce these products and could not have produced them. They emerged from a specific cultural moment's relationship to the character, and they have been the subject of significant academic writing about the ways in which commercially produced characters can be adopted and transformed by communities that the original producers did not anticipate. The Simpsons merchandise empire's current state is considerably more controlled and considerably more self-aware than its early 90s version. The licensing operation is managed with the kind of creative oversight that was not present in the initial rush to commercial exploitation, and products that emerge from the official licensing process generally have a more consistent relationship to the show's actual creative identity. But the sheer volume of material that was produced in those early years, the cereals and the bedding and the shoes and the countless objects that carried the characters' faces without any meaningful connection to their stories, remains one of the more startling examples of commercial culture's capacity to extract value from creative work and to separate that value from the thing that created it. Number. Section 8. The Foreign Simpsons, How Different Countries Changed the Show. The Simpsons exists in at least a dozen different versions simultaneously. The show that American audiences watch is not the show that German audiences watch, or Brazilian audiences, or Japanese audiences, or the audiences in any of the dozens of countries where the show has been broadcast over its 36-year run. The differences between these versions range from minor translation choices to wholesale reconstruction of episodes and characters, and the story of how a fundamentally American show was adapted for global consumption is one of the stranger and more illuminating stories in the history of international television. The most extensive non-English version of The Simpsons is the German dub, which has been in continuous production since the show's first German broadcast in 1991. The German version has developed its own distinct identity over 3.5 decades, to the point where German fans often express a preference for the German version even when they are capable of watching the original English. The voice cast of the German dub has achieved a celebrity status in Germany that is comparable to, if somewhat less extensive than, the American cast status in the United States. What makes the German version particularly interesting is the degree to which cultural adaptation has changed specific jokes. American jokes that depend on knowledge of American cultural references, American political history, American institutional structures, often cannot survive direct translation because the German audience does not share the reference frame. The German adaptation team, working over decades, developed a practice of substituting German cultural references in place of American ones, finding equivalents that produce the same comic effect in the German cultural context, even when the specific content was completely different. This practice has created situations where German and American fans watching what is nominally the same episode are actually watching different shows at specific moments. A joke about a minor American political figure becomes a joke about a minor German political figure. A reference to an American news event becomes a reference to a German one. The architecture of the joke, the structure of the setup and punchline, remains constant, but the content that fills that architecture is culturally specific to the target audience. The Spanish-language versions of The Simpsons create their own complicated picture, because the show is not dubbed into a single Spanish but into at least two distinct versions, one for Spain and one for Latin America, that reflect the significant differences in vocabulary, pronunciation, and cultural reference between Castilian Spanish and the various Latin American Spanish dialects. A joke that works in Madrid's cultural context might not work in Mexico City's, and vice versa, so the two Spanish versions are not simply translations of each other but independent adaptations that share a source text. The Brazilian Portuguese dub is the version that has generated the most sustained academic discussion among researchers studying global media localization. Brazil is one of the show's largest international markets, and the Brazilian dub has been produced with a level of creative investment that has resulted in a version that Brazilian audiences often describe as superior to the American original in specific respects. The voice performances in the Brazilian version are widely praised, and certain jokes have been localized in ways that Brazilian critics have described as genuinely funnier for a Brazilian audience than the American version would be. The French version has its own interesting history, specifically in relation to the character of Homer. French audiences and critics have reportedly been more sympathetic to Homer as a character than American audiences, reading him as a kind of everyman whose failures are more social and systemic than personal. The French dub has, consciously or not, tended to shade Homer's voice performance towards something slightly more sympathetic and slightly less blustering than the English original. And this difference has been noted by French viewers who are also familiar with the English version. Japan presents the most complex case study in Simpsons' international reception, for reasons that have more to do with cultural distance than translation difficulty. The Simpsons entered the Japanese market considerably later than it entered most major European markets, and it has never achieved the same level of cultural penetration in Japan that it has in the countries where it has been broadcast for decades. Japanese pop culture has its own robust tradition of animation that occupies a completely different aesthetic and narrative territory than The Simpsons, and the show has consistently struggled to find a position in the Japanese market relative to its global standing. The Japanese dub of The Simpsons exists and has been in production, but it has not become a fixture of Japanese popular culture in the way that American animation from the same era, particularly Warner Brothers. Cartoons, had become. The specific humor of the show, which depends on familiarity with American domestic culture and American political and institutional life, presents translation challenges in the Japanese context that the European dubs do not face to the same degree because the cultural distance is greater and the available substitution equivalents are less readily apparent. There is a fascinating specific case that involves one episode's treatment across multiple national markets, and that reveals how differently the show's content is received and managed in different cultural contexts. The episode Homer vs. Patty and Selma from Season 6 involves Homer borrowing money from Marge's sisters and the power dynamic that results. In the episode, Patty and Selma are shown working as motor vehicle employees, which is part of a recurring joke about the specific grimness of their professional lives. This episode caused essentially no controversy in the American market. The same episode, in various international markets, was handled very differently in terms of the degree to which the sisters' mockery of Homer was permitted to be as cutting as the English version. In several international versions, lines that were considered too aggressive in the domestic context of the target culture were softened or removed, reflecting a judgment that the specific kind of family members mocking each other humor that the show uses comfortably was not universally legible as comedy. In cultural contexts where mockery within a family has different social weight than it does in the American framework that the show inhabits, the same jokes landed differently, and the adaptation teams made decisions accordingly. The most dramatic intervention that any international broadcaster has made in the show's content is not a translation choice but a broadcasting policy choice. In the United Kingdom, Channel 4, which was the original British broadcaster for the show, made decisions about episode ordering and seasonal packaging that differed from the American broadcast in ways that created a different viewing experience for British audiences in the early years. Episodes were sometimes broadcast out of their American order, meaning that British audiences experienced character development and storyline evolution in a different sequence than was intended. This sounds like a minor technical point, but it had real effects on how British audiences understood certain character arcs. A character's behavior in an episode makes more sense if you have seen the previous episode, and if the previous episode has not been broadcast yet in your market, the behavior can seem unmotivated or inconsistent. Some of the early British critical reception of the show reflects this experience, noting inconsistencies in character that were actually artifacts of the episode sequencing rather than actual inconsistencies in the show. The country that has had the most unusual relationship with The Simpsons is arguably Saudi Arabia, where a dubbed version called Al-Shamshun was broadcast in 2005. The Al-Shamshun adaptation was not merely a translation. It was a reconstruction that altered the characters, the setting, and the content of the show to comply with Saudi broadcasting standards and cultural norms. Homer Simpson became Omar Shamshun. His beer was replaced with non-alcoholic soda. His pork products were replaced with beef equivalents. The family attended a mosque rather than a church. References to American cultural specifics were either removed or replaced with references more legible to a Saudi audience. The adaptation was widely reported in Western media in a tone of amused disbelief, with the implication that the changes had made the show unrecognizable. This framing missed something important. Al-Shamshun was an attempt to localize a property for an audience with genuinely different cultural frameworks. Not simply to censor content, but to make the show's basic domestic comedy legible in a context where many of its original reference points did not apply. Whether the attempt succeeded is a separate question. The Al-Shamshun adaptation was cancelled after 34 episodes, with Saudi audiences reportedly finding the heavily modified version less compelling than the original, and the domestic press finding the whole exercise more culturally complicated than it had seemed from the outside. The international history of The Simpsons is also a history of international censorship, because the show's content has triggered regulatory responses in various countries at various points in its history. The political satire in the show has made it uncomfortable for certain governmental authorities. The religious humor, specifically the show's treatment of Christianity through the Flanders character and the First Church of Springfield, has generated complaints and, in some cases, regulatory review in countries where religious broadcasting standards are more restrictive than in the United States. The show's treatment of various national groups and cultural stereotypes has also generated specific complaints in the countries concerned. The Simpsons has a long history of using caricatured versions of international identity for comic purposes, and while the show's self-awareness about American cultural parochialism has generally been high enough to make this practice more self-satirizing than straightforwardly offensive, the reception in specific communities has not always interpreted it that way. Australia holds a particular distinction in this history. The episode Bart vs. Australia from Season 6, which involves Bart making a collect call to an Australian boy and the diplomatic incident that follows, generated sufficient controversy in Australia to become a recurring reference point in Australian media discussions about the show. Australian critics and audiences have repeatedly cited the episode as an example of the show's tendency to treat non-American cultures primarily as sources of comic, exotic specificity rather than as genuine alternative contexts. The show's defenders respond that it treats American culture the same way and that the satire is directed at American parochialism rather than at Australia itself. The debate continues. The global distribution of The Simpsons means that, in a specific sense, the show has been one of the most influential exports of American cultural content in the last 30 years. It is genuinely one of the most widely seen representations of American domestic life that international audiences have encountered, and the version of American life it depicts, with its nuclear family in its suburban house, its institutional structures, both functional and dysfunctional, its economic anxieties and its cultural optimism, has shaped international understanding of American identity in ways that are difficult to measure but impossible to ignore. Section 9. The legal battles, lawsuits, threats, and the fights nobody talks about. The Simpsons has been the subject of more legal action, more threats of legal action, and more creative decisions made in response to legal considerations than almost any other television show in history. This is partly a function of longevity. A show running for 36 years generates more potential legal exposure than a show that lasts 3 seasons. But it is also a function of the show's specific creative approach, which has always involved real people, real institutions, and real cultural artifacts in ways that create legal proximity to defamation, trademark, and copyright concerns. The most famous legal confrontation in the show's history is also one of the shortest-lived. In 1991, a man named Chester Gould, the creator of the Dick Tracy comic strip, claimed that Bart Simpson's design was derived from Dick Tracy characters and constituted an unauthorized use of his intellectual property. The claim was not frivolous. There are genuine visual similarities between certain Dick Tracy character designs and the basic geometry of the Simpsons character designs. Both use highly simplified, exaggerated features in a tradition of American cartoon iconography that has a long history. The claim was ultimately not pursued, in part because the legal argument would have required establishing a level of deliberate copying that was genuinely difficult to demonstrate, and in part because Fox's legal response made clear that defending the claim would be expensive and time-consuming for all parties. But the episode established something that would recur across the show's history. the legal vulnerability created by a visual and cultural style that is distinctive enough to be imitated and familiar enough to have been influenced by prior work. The show's satire of real corporations has produced some of its most interesting legal confrontations. The Simpsons has satirized dozens of specific companies over its run, and the company's responses to their satirical portrayal have ranged from amused acceptance to threatened litigation. The general legal principle that protects the show in these cases is the distinction between satire, which is constitutionally protected, and defamation, which is not. As long as the show's portrayal of a company can be understood as satirical commentary rather than false factual claims, the legal protection is robust. The most significant testing of this principle came in relation to the show's treatment of the Fox network itself. The Simpsons has, for its entire run, been broadcast on Fox, and for much of that run, the show has included satirical commentary on Fox, on Rupert Murdoch, and on the commercial and editorial practices of the broader News Corporation empire. This is an unusual situation for any television show to be in, the network airing a show that openly mocks the network and its owner, and the legal and editorial dynamics that make it possible are more complicated than they might appear. The arrangement works because of a principle that both the show's producers and the Fox network have maintained as an informal contract. The show can satirize Fox the corporation and Fox News as an institution, but it cannot make specific false factual claims about News Corporation business practices or about specific individuals within the organization in ways that would constitute defamation. The satirical license is broad but not unlimited, and periodically the show's writers have tested the limits of this arrangement in ways that required negotiation between the production and the network. There are documented cases where specific jokes or story elements were flagged by Fox's Standards and Practices Department as potentially crossing the line from satire into defamation, and where the production team either modified the content or negotiated with the network about where the line was in the specific case. The most interesting of these cases are those where the negotiation resulted in a joke that was actually funnier than the original version, because the constraint of not making a specific false claim forced the writers towards something more absurdly creative than a direct parody would have been. The show's relationship with the Church of Scientology generated one of the more unusual tensions in its legal history. The church has a well-documented history of responding aggressively to perceived criticism, and The Simpsons' depiction of Springfield's various religious institutions has occasionally included elements that Scientology-adjacent references could read as hostile. The specific mechanics of how the church communicated its concerns about specific episodes and how those communications were handled by the production team are not fully documented in public record, but several former writers have referenced the existence of this tension in interviews. Tom Cruise has appeared in the show's fictional universe, and the Cruise Scientology connection has made certain jokes about him more sensitive than jokes about other celebrities would be. The calculus is complicated. Cruise is a public figure, and therefore subject to a higher standard of acceptable satirical treatment than a private individual. But the church's history of legal action has created a practical calculus that operates independently of the strict legal analysis. The most prolonged and publicly visible legal confrontation in the show's history did not involve a corporation or a religious organization, but a specific individual, Michael Lacey and the New Times organization. In 2003, the New Times Group published an article claiming that the Simpsons writers had plagiarized jokes from a New Times columnist. The claim was detailed enough to require a serious response, and Fox's legal team engaged with it extensively. The eventual resolution involved a detailed examination of the writing history of the specific jokes in question, which revealed that the similarities were the result of similar cultural references rather than deliberate copying. Copyright claims from musicians and composers are another recurring category of legal challenge for the show. The Simpsons uses music constantly, both in the underscore that accompanies episodes and in the specific songs that characters sing or reference, and the licensing requirements for musical use are extensive. The show's music budget is substantial, but the sheer volume of musical reference over 36 seasons means that the opportunities for disputes are numerous. The most significant musical legal challenge the show has faced involves not the show itself, but its theme music. Danny Elfman's theme, written in 1989 and heard at the beginning of every episode, is one of the most recognized pieces of music in American television history. Its relationship to prior compositions, specifically a composition by Hans Zimmer that some critics have noted as sharing structural qualities with the Elfman theme, has been discussed in music criticism without generating formal legal action. The similarities, if real, are likely in the category of shared stylistic influence rather than deliberate appropriation. The show's political satire has created international legal considerations that the American legal framework does not capture. In countries with stronger protection of political reputations than the United States provides, the show's treatment of political figures has occasionally required modification or generated formal complaints through regulatory channels. The British broadcasting regulator, Ofcom, received complaints about specific episodes on several occasions, though none resulted in sanctions. There is a category of legal consideration that is less about litigation and more about the chilling effect of legal concern on creative choices. The show's writers have, over the years, developed a practice of self-censorship that is calibrated to avoid specific categories of legal risk without explicit direction from the network's legal department. This practice is not formalized, meaning there is no written list of prohibited content, but the culture of the writer's room includes an awareness of what kinds of content generate legal review and an informal tendency to avoid those areas unless the creative payoff is significant. The most consequential area of this informal self-censorship is the treatment of specific living individuals in specific narratives. The show can depict Homer meeting a living celebrity in a comedic context because the comedy makes the satirical intent clear. The show is more cautious about depicting a living individual doing something that, if taken as a factual claim, would constitute defamation, even if the satirical framing is clear to the production team. The legal standard is not what the production team intends, but what a reasonable person might understand the content to be claiming. The show's treatment of drug use is another area where legal and regulatory considerations have shaped content in ways that are not always visible in the finished episodes. American broadcasting standards around the depiction of illegal drug use have evolved significantly over the show's run, and the show's treatment of this content has evolved with them, sometimes pushing against the standards and sometimes retreating from them in response to specific regulatory feedback. The alcohol storylines involving Homer are the most visible example of content that has been negotiated between the show's creative impulses and its regulatory environment. Homer's relationship to beer and alcohol is a defining character trait, and the show has depicted that relationship in a range of ways, from purely comedic to genuinely concerning. The network and the show's producers have maintained an ongoing negotiation about where the depiction crosses from character comedy into content that might be read as glorifying or normalizing problematic drinking behavior. The legal history of The Simpsons, taken as a whole, reveals something important about the show's position in American cultural and legal life. The show is large enough to generate real legal risk and prominent enough that real legal actors are motivated to pursue that risk when they perceive it. But the show is also creative enough and legally sophisticated enough that it has navigated 36 years of this risk without a catastrophic legal outcome. The legal battles the show has had are real and sometimes significant. The legal battles the show avoided, through careful creative choices and aggressive legal defense, are what allowed the show to remain as sharp as it has been for as long as it has. Number Section 10. The endings that almost happened, how the show nearly stopped. The Simpsons has ended, in the sense of nearly stopping production and broadcasting its final episode, at least 4 times that can be documented from public records and production histories. The story of each near ending is different, and together they trace the show's relationship with its own mortality across 36 years of television that it was never quite supposed to have. The first near ending happened before the show had produced enough episodes to be considered established. In the late stages of the first season, with the production still finding its footing and the ratings still proving unpredictable, Fox executives who had commissioned the show began expressing concerns about its future. The animation quality, which was genuinely problematic in the first several episodes, was generating internal debate about whether the show was ready for prime time in the literal sense. The voice performances were strong, the writing was strong. The animation was, in places, significantly below the standard that a network primetime show required. The decision about whether to renew the show for a second season was not automatic. There were voices within Fox's executive structure who argued that the animation problems were too fundamental to correct quickly enough to justify renewal, and that the better decision was to cut losses. The voices in favor of renewal prevailed, largely because the episodes that had overcome their animation problems demonstrated a quality of writing and performance that was clearly above average for the network's comedy slate. But the decision was not unanimous, and was not made without genuine uncertainty. The second near ending is better documented and considerably more dramatic. In 2004, the contract negotiations between Fox and the main cast reached an impasse severe enough that the network publicly stated it was prepared to continue the show without the original voice cast. This was not a bluff designed to generate negotiating leverage. Fox had actually commissioned work on what a recast Simpsons would look like, what it would cost to replace the voices, and whether the resulting show would be commercially viable enough to justify the creative and reputational cost of recasting. The production team's response to this threat was to treat it as a genuine creative emergency. The prospect of The Simpsons continuing without Dan Castellaneta's Homer, or Julie Kavner's Marge, or Nancy Cartwright's Bart was understood within the production as tantamount to cancellation because the show's identity was so completely bound up with those performances that a version without them would not meaningfully be the same show. The negotiations were conducted with this understanding in view, and the resolution, which kept the original cast in place at significantly higher compensation, reflected a judgment that the cost of recasting was higher than the cost of the settlement. The third near ending was the Harry Shearer situation of 2015, which has been mentioned in the voice recording section but deserves a fuller accounting in this context. Shearer's announcement of his intention to leave the show was made publicly, in a way that was unusual for a contract dispute at this level. He posted on social media that he was leaving the show, citing contract terms that he argued would prevent him from pursuing other professional opportunities. The public nature of the announcement created a media dynamic that complicated the negotiation, because both parties now had public positions to defend, as well as a contract dispute to resolve. The show's producers publicly acknowledged that recasting Shearer's characters was a possibility they were prepared to execute. Given the number of significant characters Shearer voices, the prospect was daunting. Ned Flanders without his original voice, Mr. Burns without his original voice, Principal Skinner without his original voice. These were not peripheral characters. They were integral to the show's texture, and replacing all of them simultaneously would have produced a version of Springfield that long-term viewers would have found profoundly alien. The negotiation ultimately resolved in Shearer's return, but the months during which his departure was announced and the recasting was being discussed were genuinely uncertain. The show continued production during this period, with the assumption that either the negotiation would be resolved or the recasting would proceed. The emotional reality inside the production, with the cast wondering whether their longtime colleague and ensemble partner would return, is something that participants have described as genuinely stressful, in ways that the eventual resolution made it tempting to minimize. The fourth near ending is the one that never quite became a public crisis, but that has been alluded to often enough in interviews to be understood as real. During a period in the mid-2000s when the show's ratings were declining and its critical standing was at a nadir, there were conversations within Fox's executive structure about whether the show's commercial value was sufficient to justify its production costs. The show had become expensive to produce, the cast's compensation alone representing a significant ongoing cost, and the ratings that had once justified that expense were no longer at the same level. The conversation did not produce a cancellation decision, but it produced something that affected the show's production culture, an awareness that the show's continuation was not guaranteed in the way it had once seemed to be, and that the specific commercial math of producing the show needed to improve if its continuation was to be assured. The response involved adjustments to the production budget, negotiations with the cast that modified some compensation structures, and a more active effort to demonstrate the show's continued international value as an export rather than relying primarily on domestic ratings. There is one near ending that is not documented in public records because it never became visible publicly, but that is referenced in enough off-the-record accounts to be understood as having been real. During the Shearer situation of 2015, there was apparently a parallel conversation within the production about whether the Shearer departure might be the moment to end the show on reasonably favorable terms rather than to continue it with recasting or to end it later under less favorable circumstances. The argument for ending at that moment was essentially the argument that the show should be allowed to conclude while its cultural standing was still significant enough to make a final season a genuine event rather than a footnote. The argument against this option, which prevailed, was partly commercial and partly creative. Commercially, the show generates ongoing revenue for Fox and for the Disney-owned IP portfolio in ways that would stop immediately upon cancellation. Creatively, the producers and writers who are still finding the work interesting would prefer to continue. And there was a third argument, harder to quantify but apparently influential in the discussions. The show has never definitively resolved its characters' stories, and doing so in a final season would require making choices that would permanently close possibilities that the ongoing show keeps open. The ongoing show can still do the episode where Lisa finally gets the recognition she deserves. It can still do the episode where Homer and Marge's marriage is genuinely tested in a way that has real stakes. It can still do the episode that gives Maggie a voice. These possibilities, which exist as long as the show continues, would all be foreclosed by a final season that resolved the characters' fates. The continuation is partly a commercial decision and partly a decision to preserve the potential rather than exhaust it. The question of what a Simpsons finale would actually look like, if one were made, has occupied fans and critics for decades. The show has imagined its own ending several times within episodes, most explicitly in the flash-forward stories that imagine the characters in futures where they are older and their current situation has resolved in various ways. These imagined endings have the quality of drafts, possibilities that the show flirts with before retreating to the permanent present that the floating timeline requires. The actual ending of the show, if it comes, will be one of the most viewed television events in recent history. This is not hyperbole. The Simpsons finale will be a cultural event of the kind that the television industry has not seen since a small number of similarly long-running shows reached their conclusions, and the weight of 36 years of audience relationship will give the episode a significance that no individual episode, however well-crafted, could achieve on its own. What that finale will contain, whether it will age the characters, whether it will resolve the floating timeline, whether it will make definitive choices about what happens to these people when the loop finally breaks, is entirely unknown. The show's producers have been deliberately non-committal about these questions, partly because committing to specific answers would constrain the production in ways that serving a long-running show does not allow, and partly because the moment of the finale, whenever it comes, is the one creative decision that cannot be revised once it has been made. The near endings the show has survived have given it something unusual in television history, a long-running relationship with its own mortality that has become part of its identity. The show that has nearly ended 4 times and continued each time has a different relationship to continuity and conclusion than a show that has never faced those moments. Springfield's fictional persistence and the show's actual persistence have reinforced each other in ways that make the eventual ending, when it comes, feel like something more than a production decision. It will feel like the breaking of a loop that has been running since 1989, the moment when Bart finally turns 11, when the permanent present finally moves, when the show allows itself to become the thing it has been circling for 36 years without quite landing on, a story that ends. Until that moment, the show goes on. The couch gag plays, Homer goes to work, Bart writes on the chalkboard, Lisa plays her saxophone, Maggie watches everything from her stroller with those enormous knowing eyes, and Springfield remains exactly where it always has been. Nowhere on the map, everywhere in the culture, unchanged and unchangeable in a world that has been changing around it since before most of its audience was born. That is the real miracle of The Simpsons, if miracle is the right word. It is not that the show has been on this long, though that itself is genuinely remarkable. It is that the show has been on this long and the characters still feel like themselves, still feel like people you know, still feel like a family you have been visiting for years. The technical achievement of keeping a voice cast together, a creative team functioning, an animation pipeline operating for 36 years across changes in technology and industry and culture is substantial. But the achievement beneath that achievement, the maintenance of the emotional connection between the audience and these characters across all of that time, is harder to explain and harder to replicate. The Simpsons will end. Everything ends. But until it does, Springfield will be there on Sunday nights, yellow and impossible and more real than most places you can actually visit, running the same loop it has been running since before the internet existed, before the Berlin Wall came down, before half its current audience was born. The loop that Homer's dreaming brain or Burns's radiation or Springfield's collective denial or all of those things together keeps spinning. And every time you watch it, you are choosing, like Springfield itself, to keep the story going a little longer. to not press play on the timeline, to sit in the living room on Evergreen Terrace for one more Sunday night, while the kids are still young and the beer is still cold and nobody has to say goodbye yet. That is The Simpsons. All 36 years of it. All 788 episodes. All the lost episodes and abandoned concepts and scrapped stories and discarded ideas that would have changed everything. All the voices and the recording sessions and the ensemble chemistry that made those voices into people. All the legal battles and the merchandise and the international versions and the near endings and the ongoing arguments about when the show got worse and whether it ever really got worse at all. All of it is Springfield. And Springfield, as you now know better than almost anyone watching it casually ever will, is considerably stranger and richer and more interesting than it looks from the outside. Script continues below. Number, Section 6. The Guest Star Underground. What really happened behind the scenes? The Simpsons has hosted more celebrity guest appearances than any other scripted television program in the history of the medium. The number is not contested. It has climbed past 600 when recurring guests and one-off appearances are counted together, and it has become part of the show's identity as thoroughly as the yellow skin or the floating timeline. But the public story of those appearances, the promotional version in which a famous person lent their voice to Springfield and everyone had a wonderful time, is a significantly simplified account of what actually occurred. The real story involves variable levels of preparation, creative disagreements, moments of genuine discomfort in the recording booth, and decisions that shaped the show's history in ways nobody anticipated. The guest star strategy of the early seasons operated on principles fundamentally different from those that governed it once the show achieved cultural dominance. In the first 3 seasons, guest appearances were rare enough to feel like genuine events, and the production team approached each one with a specific question. What could this particular person do that nobody else could? The show was not building a collection of famous names. It was deploying specific individuals for specific creative purposes, because those purposes demanded those specific people, and the show was not willing to substitute. Albert Brooks appeared in 3 early season episodes in roles written specifically for his particular brand of intelligent, neurotic, self-undermining charm. The characters he voiced were not simply Albert Brooks playing a Simpsons character. They were characters that could only be voiced convincingly by someone with his specific comic quality. Someone who could make intelligence sound like both a gift and a burden. Someone whose persona could carry a kind of warmly delivered cruelty that the roles required. The show went to Brooks because it had written characters that only Brooks could inhabit. That is a fundamentally different creative logic from the logic that produced the later seasons' steady parade of celebrity voices. The shift happened gradually as the show's cultural standing rose high enough that the guest appearance itself became a form of cultural certification. An appearance on The Simpsons by the mid-90s signaled something specific. You were famous enough to be satirized by the show that satirized everything, self-aware enough to be in on the joke, and culturally significant enough that the show wanted you. This signal was valuable to celebrities and their representatives in ways that shifted the negotiating dynamics substantially. Instead of the show approaching specific people for specific creative purposes, the show found itself managing incoming demand from people who wanted the cultural certification the appearance provided. Managing demand rather than executing a creative strategy produces different results. The later season's guest appearances, as a category, are well executed by the standards of what they are trying to do. They are simply trying to do something less creatively specific than what the early appearances attempted. Kelsey Grammer's ongoing involvement through Sideshow Bob represents one of the more productive long-term guest relationships in the show's history, partly because Grammer approached the work as a trained classical actor who enjoyed the comic potential of the character, and partly because the writers kept finding new angles on Bob even as the basic premise grew well-worn. Grammer's recording sessions were consistently described by production staff as efficient and creatively satisfying. He arrived knowing what he wanted to do and was technically skilled enough to execute it without extensive direction. The Bob character's comedy depends on patrician contempt delivered with crystalline precision, and Grammer had developed the performance across enough episodes that it had become an instrument he knew exactly how to play. Michael Jackson's appearance generates the most discussion, partly because of the subsequent history surrounding it, and partly because the recording circumstances were genuinely unusual. Jackson had contacted the show's producers to express his desire to appear, which inverted the normal guest recruitment process. The show did not approach Jackson. Jackson approached the show. His preparation for the session was thorough in ways that surprised the production team, who had learned through experience that celebrity enthusiasm did not always translate into professional preparation for the specific demands of voice recording. What made the session unusual was the contractual arrangement surrounding it, specifically the pseudonym under which Jackson recorded, the ambiguity he maintained about whether he was providing his own voice or acting a character who claimed to be Michael Jackson, and his subsequent suggestion that a professional singer had provided the musical portions. The production team's account of what occurred in the booth differs in specific ways from Jackson's public account, and the gap between those accounts has never been fully resolved. The episode's removal from circulation following the 2019 documentary examining allegations against Jackson is the most significant act of retrospective editorial control in the show's history, and its unavailability through official channels has given it a mythological status it would not otherwise possess. Elizabeth Taylor's participation involved what is almost certainly the most precisely demanded single vocal performance in the show's recording history. The requirement was for a single word, the word daddy, delivered in a way that was simultaneously warm and surprising, funny and genuinely touching. The decision to approach Taylor came from a conversation about which voice, from any performer available, would give this word the specific quality of significance the moment required. Her specific vocal presence, the warmth and weight her voice carried even in casual speech, was determined to be exactly right. The session was reportedly longer than its single-word content might suggest, because the production team had specific ideas about emotional coloring, and Taylor was willing to explore multiple approaches. The result was exactly the performance the show had been looking for. Paul McCartney's condition for participating, that Lisa's vegetarianism would be permanent, is the single most consequential creative intervention a guest performer has ever made on the show. The condition was not subtle or negotiable. The production team's decision to accept it reflected a judgment that the episode was better with McCartney than without him, and that the character change was consistent with who Lisa was. A brilliant, principled 8-year-old who encounters a persuasive argument for vegetarianism and adopts it as behaving in exactly the way the Lisa the show had been developing would plausibly behave. The condition has been honored in every episode across every season under every showrunner since. New writers joining the room are informed of it as a foundational fact about the character. The condition, accepted in a single negotiation, has shaped the character's definition permanently and without exception. The recording experience varied enormously depending on who was in the booth. A range of preparation existed among the hundreds of celebrities who passed through, from the meticulous to the essentially absent. Several performers who appeared in later seasons have described, in retrospect, being surprised by how demanding the recording process was. The booth is a specific and unforgiving environment, a small room with a microphone and headphones and a window through which producers evaluate your performance and ask you to repeat it if it does not achieve what they require. For performers accustomed to being the most important person on a set, to having the environment reshape itself around their process, this dynamic could be genuinely uncomfortable. Stephen Hawking's recording sessions represent a unique category because the technical means by which Hawking communicated required the production to develop an entirely different approach. Hawking communicated through a speech-generating device that converted intentional muscular movements into electronic speech, and this synthesized speech was itself the voice the show used for his character. There was no performance direction in the conventional sense. The sessions were collaborative in a different way, more like consultation about text than direction of performance, with the production team presenting scripted lines and Hawking reviewing and occasionally modifying them through his communication system. The results are genuinely funny, because Hawking had a comic sensibility that expressed itself clearly in his material choices, and the synthesized voice became part of the joke rather than a limitation on the performance. The guest star history ultimately reflects the show's own cultural history in miniature. In the early years, appearances were precise creative deployments. In the peak years, they were cultural rituals in which fame certified itself. In the later years, they have become institutional, part of the mechanics of maintaining a program of this age and size. What has remained constant is the specific pleasure of a well-executed guest appearance, the moment when a famous voice appears in Springfield and is somehow exactly right in context. When the celebrity and the character merge completely enough that you stop thinking about the person in the booth and start thinking about the person in the story. Number. Section 7. The merchandise empire. The strange, dark, and forgotten world of Simpsons products. There is a material history of The Simpsons that runs in parallel with its broadcast history, a history composed of objects rather than episodes, of products rather than stories. It is in many ways a stranger and more revealing history than the broadcast record, because it documents what happens when a creative property becomes a commercial property large enough to generate objects whose relationship to their creative origin has been essentially severed. You can hold some of these objects in your hand and find it genuinely difficult to explain what they have to do with a family in a cartoon house in an unmappable town. The commercial exploitation began before the show had established itself as a cultural phenomenon, which is itself one of the more remarkable facts in its commercial history. Fox moved to license the characters during the first season, while the ratings were still proving themselves and the episodes were still finding their creative footing. The decision was a forward bet on commercial potential made before that potential had been demonstrated. The bet was correct, more correct than anyone had calculated. The Bart Simpson merchandise of 1990 became one of the most documented retail phenomena of that decade. The T-shirts appeared in quantities the licensing industry cited as records. Underachiever and proud of it, printed on a yellow shirt, became a flashpoint in debates about children's media, with multiple school districts banning the shirts and parent organizations calling for Fox to pull the line. Fox did not pull the line. The controversy generated additional coverage, and the additional coverage generated additional sales. The school districts had accidentally become an advertising campaign. What made Bart commercially valuable in this specific way was not the Bart who existed in the episodes. It was a surface image of anti-authoritarianism, a child who said things that slightly violated the social contract between children and the adults governing their lives. The merchandise sold a posture, an attitude, extracting one quality of the character, its most commercially legible quality, and presenting it as the totality of who Bart was. The show's creative team had built a considerably more complicated Bart, genuinely affectionate, frequently insecure beneath the bravado, capable of unexpected vulnerability. The merchandise Bart and the episode Bart were not the same character. The merchandise Bart made far more money. The video game history runs from the late 1980s to the present, and encompasses enough variation in quality and approach to constitute its own case study in the relationship between licensed properties and the games. Industry. The earliest home console games used the property's visual identity without having genuine access to what made the property interesting. The characters looked like themselves. The settings were recognizable, but the voice performances, the character writing, the specific humor were absent because the licensing deals did not and could not include them. The games were functional as games. They were essentially useless as Simpsons experiences. The Konami arcade game of 1991 stands apart as the clearest example of what a Simpsons game could be when the production had genuine access to the source material. Konami secured voice recordings from the actual cast, which was expensive, and which immediately distinguished the game from every home console product of the period. The animation replicated the show's visual style with real fidelity. The game's story was coherent within the show's world. The gameplay was a side-scrolling format with no particular relationship to The Simpsons as a narrative, but it was executed with enough craft and with enough of the show's specific energy that the experience of playing it felt connected to the experience of watching the show. The game's nostalgic power for people who encountered it in arcades during the early 90s is a genuine cultural phenomenon. The specific social context of arcade play, the physical cabinet, the coin-operated economy that made each life consequential, the experience of watching other players, created a version of the Simpsons experience that has not been replicable since arcades became obsolete. The game became a touchstone not just because it was good, but because it was good in a specific context that time has made irretrievable. The 2007 game called simply The Simpsons Game is the most substantive, interactive product the show has generated in terms of its relationship to the show's actual creative identity. The game was produced with significant involvement from the show's writing staff, distinguishing it from every previous Simpsons game. The script was written by people who understood the show's voice and who were not intimidated by the self-referential ambition of the project, which involved the family becoming aware that they are characters in a video game and exploring the implications of that awareness. The game satirized video game culture through The Simpsons' characteristic lens of affectionate mockery, and it did this with enough comic precision that it worked both as satire and as entertainment. in a way that most licensed games achieve with neither. The Springfield mobile game, launched in 2012 and still operating as of this writing, is the commercial product that has most fully explored the specific desire that dedicated fans have to inhabit the show's universe rather than simply observe it. The premise that you build and expand your own version of Springfield by unlocking characters and locations over time taps directly into the pleasure of knowing Springfield well enough to want to live there in some active sense. The game's longevity, more than a decade of continuous operation, reflects the depth of that desire and the richness of the universe that 30-plus years of the show had built. The bootleg merchandise phenomenon of the early 90s is one of the more culturally interesting chapters in the show's commercial history because the bootlegs represent something the official licensing apparatus could not produce. Genuine cultural appropriation in the academic sense, communities taking a commercial product and remaking it in forms that express their own specific relationships to the material. The Bart Simpson t-shirts that appeared in communities the official licensing operation had not specifically targeted, combining his image with the visual languages from those communities' own cultural traditions, were objects the Fox licensing office had nothing to do with and could not have produced even if it had tried. These objects are interesting now as artifacts of a specific cultural moment when a television character had achieved wide enough recognition to be adopted by communities that related to him for reasons the show's creators had not specifically intended. The legal question of whether those objects infringe the show's intellectual property is distinct from the cultural question of what they represent, and the cultural question is the more interesting one. The merchandise empire's current state is organized and mature in ways that its 1990 version was not. The licensing operation is managed with creative oversight that was absent from the initial commercial rush. But the scale of the commercial operation means that the distance between the creative work and its commercial exploitation remains significant. The Homer on a coffee mug in a gas station in any country in the world is the same Homer who has moments of genuine emotional depth in the show's best episodes, but the coffee mug does not know that. The merchandise makes the show famous in a shallow sense. The show makes the merchandise valuable in a deep one. The tension between those two functions has defined the show's commercial life since its first year, and it has never been fully resolved because it cannot be, because the commercial logic and the creative logic point in genuinely different directions, and neither can be abandoned without losing something essential. Section 8. The Foreign Simpsons. How different countries changed the show. The Simpsons is simultaneously one show and several dozen shows, existing in parallel versions across dozens of languages and national markets, each version a specific negotiation between the American original and the cultural context into which it has been introduced. The differences between these versions range from the trivial, a word choice and a subtitle, to the fundamental, wholesale reconstruction of content to comply with broadcasting standards or cultural expectations that differ entirely from the American ones. The German language version has the longest production history among non-English versions and has developed the most distinct identity relative to the original. It has been in continuous production since 1991. Meaning it has had nearly as long to develop its own specific qualities as the original has had to develop its own. The German voice cast has achieved cultural prominence within German entertainment that reflects how thoroughly the German audience has adopted this version as its own. German viewers who are fully capable of watching the English original frequently express a genuine preference for the German version, and their preference is based not on linguistic comfort alone, but on a judgment that the German adaptation works in ways the original would not, if simply translated. The localization challenges concentrate around humor that depends on specifically American cultural knowledge. The show is saturated with references to American political history, American regional identity, American institutional life, American entertainment, and sporting culture. These references are not decorative. They are frequently structural elements of jokes, and jokes whose structure depends on knowledge the target audience does not share are jokes that do not work. The German adaptation team developed a consistent approach over 3 decades, cultural substitution rather than explanation. American references are replaced with German references of equivalent cultural weight, preserving the joke's architecture while replacing its content with material the German audience can access without effort. This practice created a specific and well-documented phenomenon. German and American audiences watching the same episode are, at specific moments, watching different shows. The episodes look identical. The characters are the same. But the specific content of certain jokes differs in ways that are significant because the cultural references filling the joke structure differ. A joke about an obscure American political figure becomes a joke about an obscure German political figure. The comedy works in both markets because the structural logic is identical, but the specific knowledge required and the specific cultural target are different. The Brazilian Portuguese dub has attracted specific academic attention as an unusually successful localization. Brazilian audiences and critics have in significant numbers expressed preference for the Brazilian version over the original, even with access to the original. This preference reflects a judgment that the adaptation has captured the show's comic energy in ways that a close translation would not achieve. The localization team has been especially skilled at identifying points where literal translation would produce flat results and finding Brazilian cultural equivalents that preserve the joke's actual function rather than its literal content. The relationship between the two Spanish-language versions, one for Spain and one for Latin America, reflects a judgment that the differences between Castilian Spanish and Latin American Spanish dialects are significant enough in vocabulary, cultural reference, and pronunciation that a single version would serve neither market adequately. Each version has developed its own casting traditions and localization approaches in ways that make them distinct creative objects rather than minor variations of the same translation. The Japanese market is one of the show's significant commercial failures, paradoxically in a country with a deeply developed animation culture and genuine appetite for American entertainment. The failure is instructive because Japan's animation tradition is so developed and so specific in its conventions. Japanese animation has established character design conventions, narrative structural preferences, emotional registers, and humor traditions developed across decades of domestic production. The Simpsons fits none of these conventions. Its character designs violate expectations for how human figures are represented in Japanese animation. Its structural comedy approach differs from what Japanese audiences have been culturally prepared to receive. No amount of localization addresses a fundamental mismatch of this kind, because the mismatch is not in the language but in the underlying aesthetic conventions the language carries. Al-Shamsun, the Saudi Arabian adaptation that aired in 2005, represents the most radical reconstruction the show has undergone in any market. The changes were fundamental. Alcohol was removed entirely. Pork was removed. The family's religious practice relocated from a Christian church to a mosque. Character names were Arabized. Cultural references assuming familiarity with American life were replaced with references assuming familiarity with Saudi life. The visual content, which could not be changed, remained American, creating a dissonance between images designed for one cultural context and dialogue adapted for another. The adaptation was canceled after 34 episodes. The Western reading has been that the content changes made the show unrecognizable. This misses something. Al-Shamsun was a genuine attempt to make an aggressively culture-specific show legible in a very different cultural context. The attempt failed, but it was not simply censorship. It was a localization project that could not bridge a cultural distance that was simply too large. The international censorship history of the show reveals what different cultures find most threatening in its content. Political satire, unremarkable in the American context, has triggered regulatory attention in countries where political satire has different legal standing. Religious humor has generated formal complaints in countries with more restrictive broadcasting standards. Specific national caricatures have generated protests in the countries concerned, and the show's responses have varied from modification to defense depending on the specific commercial and cultural considerations involved. The most enduring international controversy involves Australia following the episode about Bart's collect call and its diplomatic consequences. Australian critics and audiences have returned to that episode repeatedly as a reference point for the show's treatment of non-American cultures, reading it as American parochialism dressed as self-satire. The show's defenders read it as genuine self-satire directed at America's institutional response rather than at Australia itself. This disagreement reflects a genuine interpretive ambiguity in the episode, and the fact that it remains contested 30 years later reflects how differently the show reads, depending on whether you are inside the culture it is examining or outside it. From inside, it reads as self-criticism. From outside, it reads as the thing being criticized wearing a satirical costume. What the international history ultimately demonstrates is that culture, when it travels, does not travel intact. It arrives at each destination as raw material that the receiving culture processes through its own frameworks, producing results that may bear only a family resemblance to the original. The Simpsons, that exists across 40 countries in 20 languages, is 20 different shows in 40 different cultural contexts, each one a specific negotiation between what the original intended and what each particular place could receive and reward and sustain. Number. Section 9. The legal battles, lawsuits, threats, and the fights nobody talks about. The legal history of The Simpsons is longer and more interesting than the show's promotional materials would suggest, and understanding it requires understanding something fundamental about the relationship between creative ambition and institutional protection in commercial entertainment. A show running for 36 years that consistently engages with real people, real institutions, and real cultural phenomena is a show that generates legal risk in large quantities, and the specific strategies it develops for managing that risk tell you something important about the gap between what the show wants to say and what it is allowed to say. The earliest legal tension in the show's history came not from an external challenger but from within Fox itself. In the months before the premiere, there were internal discussions about whether certain content elements, particularly the show's satirical treatment of institutional authority, would survive the broadcast standards review process. James L. Brooks, whose production reputation and commercial track record gave him significant leverage in network negotiations, defended the content on the grounds that it was clearly satirical and therefore protected both legally and editorially. These early negotiations established a working relationship between the production and the network's standards operation that has been described by participants as unusually collaborative rather than adversarial. The show agreed to flag sensitive content in advance. The network agreed to evaluate that content on its satirical merits, rather than applying blanket restrictions. The show's treatment of Fox itself is one of the most interesting ongoing editorial negotiations in television history. A program that mocks its own broadcaster is, from the network's perspective, a commercial and editorial liability. And yet Fox has allowed this mockery to continue for 3.5 decades, because the alternative, forcing the show to stop, would generate negative coverage and undermine the show's credibility as a genuine satirical voice. The informal agreement that has governed this relationship amounts to: the show can satirize Fox as an institution and News Corporation's business practices in general terms, but it cannot make specific false factual claims about individuals within the organization in ways that would constitute defamation rather than satire. The show's writers have tested this line repeatedly. The fact that the show has never been successfully sued by its own broadcaster reflects both their skill at staying on the permissible side and the network's pragmatic calculation that forcing the issue costs more than it gains. The musical rights situation is a recurring source of both creative achievement and legal complexity. The show uses music constantly, as diegetic performance, as satirical reference, and the legal requirements for each category of use are different and demanding. The underscore that accompanies episodes is typically composed specifically for the show, avoiding the complications of licensing existing recordings. But the songs characters sing, the musical references jokes depend on, and the specific pieces that define particular moments all require licensing from publishers and rights holders whose expectations about compensation have varied significantly over decades. Danny Elfman's theme music is the most legally significant piece of original composition in the show's history, and the relationship around it is more complex than it appears. Elfman was hired to compose the theme at compensation modest by the standards of what the theme has subsequently been worth. The theme's commercial value, embedded in every episode and every international licensing arrangement that includes the opening credits, vastly exceeds what Elfman received for composing it. The contractual arrangements governing the ongoing relationship between Elfman, the production company, and Fox regarding the theme's commercial exploitation have not been fully disclosed publicly, and the relationship has been the subject of ongoing negotiation across decades. The corporate parody situations provide some of the more instructive case studies in where satire ends and other legal categories begin. The show has satirized dozens of specific corporations, and the responses have varied from amused acceptance to threatened legal action to the kind of sustained quiet pressure that never quite becomes formal, but that shapes production decisions nonetheless. The most interesting cases are the ones where corporate response changed what the show did Not through explicit legal pressure, but through the implied threat that companies communicate through their public relations operations and legal departments' background conversations with networks and production companies. These cases are difficult to document precisely because the communication is often informal, and the resulting creative changes are attributed to editorial rather than legal considerations. But the pattern, examining multiple instances of the show's treatment of specific industries, shifting in specific ways at specific times, suggests that legal consideration has shaped the show's satirical choices more than the public narrative acknowledges. The Church of Scientology presents one of the show's more sensitive ongoing relationships in this category. The Church has a well-documented history of responding aggressively to perceived criticism through both public relations and legal channels. The show's writers have, in various interviews given after leaving the production, described an awareness of this history in the writing of jokes touching on Scientology or on celebrities associated with it. The specific mechanics of how this awareness translated into production decisions are not fully documented, but the pattern of what the show has and has not said about Scientology over 36 years suggests that the legal context was a factor. The labor history of the show's own production is under-examined, given its significance. The Writers Guild of America, the Animation Guild, and the Screen Actors Guild all have members who work on The Simpsons, and the show's production has been affected by labor actions these unions have undertaken over the years. The broader industry strikes that have periodically disrupted television production across multiple shows affected The Simpsons specifically in ways that shaped episodes and seasons in ways not always visible in the finished product. The show's obligations to its various union contracts created specific constraints on what production could continue during work stoppages, and the creative decisions made during those periods carried forward into the episodes that followed. The intellectual property landscape around the show has become more complex as the digital environment created new categories of use and misuse. Fan fiction, fan videos, fan artwork, amateur parody, unauthorized merchandise. All of these categories of secondary creative work based on the show's characters and universe are activities that the intellectual property owners have the legal right to restrict, but that have been managed with varying levels of aggressiveness at different times. The prevailing approach has been to tolerate non-commercial fan activity while actively pursuing commercial uses that represent unauthorized competition with the official licensing operation. This creates a gray zone around fan activity with commercial dimensions. Content creators who build audiences based on Simpsons content and monetize those audiences through advertising revenue, fan products sold in small quantities, amateur creations that charge modest fees. The gray zone has never been fully resolved because resolving it would require either alienating a fan community whose enthusiasm is commercially valuable or providing a legal clarity that would invite more aggressive commercial exploitation than the current ambiguity permits. What the legal history ultimately reveals is the specific kind of cultural power that a long-running beloved show acquires, and the specific vulnerabilities that come with that power. The show is large enough to generate real legal risk, and prominent enough that real legal actors are motivated to pursue that risk when it serves their interests. But the show's cultural significance is also a form of protection, because taking aggressive legal action against The Simpsons generates negative publicity in ways that threatening an obscure program does not. The battles the show has fought, and the battles it has successfully avoided through careful creative management, together constitute a 36-year negotiation between creative ambition and institutional reality. The show has been more constrained by that negotiation than its public image of unfettered satirical freedom suggests. At the same time, it has been considerably more aggressive in its satirical ambitions than most comparable commercial products, and sustaining that aggressiveness across 3.5 decades of changing legal and cultural landscapes is itself a remarkable institutional achievement. Number Section 10. The endings that almost happened. How the show nearly stopped. There is a version of The Simpsons that ended years ago. Multiple versions, in fact. The show has approached its own conclusion at least 4 times in documented history. Each approach coming close enough to constitute a genuine near ending, each retreat producing a show that continued somewhat differently from how it had been continuing before the near ending made its presence felt. Understanding these near endings is understanding something important about the show's relationship to its own mortality and about the specific institutional forces that have kept it running long past any point when its continuation could be described as inevitable. The first near ending is the least documented because it came before the show had established the public profile that would have made its potential cancellation a matter of broad cultural interest. By the end of the first season, the show had produced 13 episodes that ranged in quality from genuinely excellent to technically compromised by animation problems that were known and being addressed but not yet solved. The ratings were solid but not the kind that automatically secured renewal. The conversation about whether to renew was not a formality within Fox. The arguments against renewal were based on real concerns. The animation quality of the first several episodes was below the standard a primetime network show required, a fact visible to viewers, and generating internal discussion about whether the production pipeline could solve the problem quickly enough to sustain a renewed series. The show's creative identity was still being established, still finding its specific balance between satirical edge and emotional warmth. The commercial case for renewal was not yet the obvious decision that it appears in retrospect. The arguments for renewal were also real. The voice performances were clearly exceptional. The writing, when the animation did not undermine it, was genuinely distinctive. The characters had a quality of presence and specificity unusual for primetime animation. The people at Fox who understood what the show was becoming, who judged it on its trajectory rather than on its wobbliest early episodes, made the case for renewal with enough conviction to carry the decision. The show was renewed. The animation problems were solved within the second season. By the end of that season, the case for the show's continuation was no longer a matter of argument. It was a matter of observed fact. The second near ending was both more public and more formally structured as a crisis. In 2004, contracts for the 6 primary voice cast members came up for renewal simultaneously, and the negotiation that followed made the potential ending more visible than any previous dispute had been. The cast negotiated as a unified block, presenting Fox with a single position rather than individual requests, and that position was significantly more expensive than Fox had anticipated or wanted to accept. Fox's response included, as a genuine element of its negotiating strategy, the statement that it was prepared to continue the show without the original cast. This was not a pure bluff. Fox commissioned work on what a recast production would look like, what it would cost, how commercially viable the result would be. The preparation was genuine because the cost of accepting the cast's terms was high enough to make the alternative worth serious evaluation. The cast's position on this was clear and consistent. They believed a recast Simpsons was not commercially viable as a proposition. The show's specific identity was inseparable from the specific voice performances that the cast had been developing for 15 years, and a version with different voices for Homer and Marge and Bart would not be the same show in any commercially meaningful sense. This belief was not simply a negotiating position. It reflected a genuine understanding, shared by most of the people who had worked on the show, of how fundamentally the show's identity depended on its performers. The negotiation resolved in the cast's favor at the levels they had sought, but the episode demonstrated something that had not previously been so clearly visible: the concentration of commercial vulnerability in 6 individuals whose simultaneous departure would end the show in any meaningful sense. Harry Shearer's situation in 2015 was different in character from the 2004 negotiation. Shearer's announcement was made publicly and unilaterally, which was unusual in the specific way such announcements are almost never made in the entertainment industry. Contract disputes at this level are typically conducted in private, with both parties maintaining public silence while the negotiation proceeds. Shearer's decision to announce publicly reflected a judgment about the leverage available to him in his situation, and the judgment was complicated. On one hand, the public announcement created pressure on Fox to resolve the situation. On the other hand, it created a public position that Shearer would find difficult to retreat from without appearing to have capitulated, limiting his negotiating flexibility. The period between the announcement and the resolution was genuinely uncertain. The characters' Shearer voices are significantly more numerous and significantly more important than those of any other single cast member. Ned Flanders, Mr. Burns, Principal Skinner, Waylon Smithers, Kent Brockman, Dr. Hibbert. These are not peripheral figures. They are integral to Springfield's texture, and replacing all of them simultaneously would have produced a version of the town that long-term viewers would have found profoundly alien. The production team's preparation for potential recast was real, not ceremonial, and the prospect of Springfield without Shearer's specific performances was one that everyone in the production found genuinely alarming. His eventual return resolved the crisis, but the episode permanently altered the show's understanding of its own structural vulnerabilities. The fourth near ending is the least documented as a formal event because it never crystallized into a specific moment of decision. It is instead a pattern of conversations, distributed across several years in the mid-2000s, in which Fox executives and show producers discussed the show's commercial viability with a candor that had not characterized earlier periods. The ratings were declining. The critical consensus was that the show's best years were significantly behind it. The production cost was high and rising. The question of whether to continue was being asked in a way it had not been asked before, with genuine uncertainty about the answer. The conversations did not produce a cancellation decision. Several factors contributed to continuation. The show's international value, generating licensing revenue, and audience engagement in markets outside the United States even as domestic ratings declined, was a significant commercial consideration. The cost of cancellation, which would terminate ongoing revenue streams rather than simply stopping a production cost, was another. And there were genuine creative advocates for continuation, people within the production who believed the show retained real creative potential, and that the quality decline was not as permanent or as deep as the critical consensus suggested. There is a near ending that never became publicly visible because it remained a private conversation. During the Shearer situation of 2015, while the public drama played out, there were discussions within the production and at the network level about whether this moment might be appropriate for concluding the show rather than resolving the disruption and continuing. The argument was the sunset argument. End on your own terms. While the show still has enough cultural presence to make a finale an event rather than a footnote, the argument did not prevail. The sunset was not chosen. What a Simpsons finale would actually contain is a question that has occupied fans and critics and industry observers for as long as the show has seemed like something that might someday end. The show has imagined its own ending within episodes multiple times, in the flash-forward stories that age the characters and resolve their situations in various ways. These imagined endings have the quality of drafts, possibilities the show approaches, before retreating to the permanent present that the floating timeline requires. The Lisa's wedding episode from the 6th season is the most fully developed imagined ending in the show's history. It follows Lisa as a young adult woman living a life recognizably produced by the Lisa we know. Accomplished, principled, still fundamentally alone in the specific way that genuinely exceptional people can be alone in a world not structured for their particular quality of mind. The episode's emotional power comes from the relationship between the Lisa of the flash forward and the Lisa of the present. The recognition that the person she becomes is exactly who the child we know would become, and that the process of becoming her involves real cost alongside real achievement. The episode ends with Lisa returning to her 8-year-old self, and the ending has a quality of melancholy that the return to the permanent present does not fully resolve. You have seen where Lisa is going. You know what the future looks like, and you are being asked to pretend you do not, to return to the comfortable suspension of a present preserved precisely because advancing it would mean watching that future arrive. The actual finale, if and when it comes, will carry the weight of 36 years of audience relationship in a way that makes it simultaneously the most anticipated and the most impossible episode in the show's history. The episode that ends The Simpsons must somehow satisfy an audience that has been watching it, in many cases for the majority of their lives. It must handle characters whose situations have been maintained in careful suspension across decades. It must be a worthy conclusion to the longest story in the history of American television comedy. Or it must do none of those things. It must simply be an episode, one more episode, the last in a sequence that has been running since before most of its audience was born, ending in the way that all things end. Without resolution, because resolution is not available. Without completion, because completion would mean the story actually being over rather than simply stopping. The show has always been more comfortable with continuity than with conclusion, more invested in the perpetual present than in the moment when the present becomes the past. The finale may be the first episode in its history that the show is structurally unprepared to make. Until that moment arrives, the loop keeps running. The family sits on the couch. The episode ends and the next one begins somewhere in the production pipeline. Another story about people in a town that cannot be found on any map, told by people who have spent varying portions of their professional lives learning how to tell it. The near endings the show has survived have given it a relationship to its own mortality that is unusual among long-running cultural institutions. A show that has nearly ended 4 times and kept going has, in some sense, already rehearsed its ending, already felt the shape of the thing that will eventually happen and chosen each time to postpone it. The postponement is not denial. It is a deliberate choice made by people who believe there is more to say and that the saying of it has value. Whether they are right is the question that the show's history cannot answer and that only the finale will eventually address. Number. Section 11. The writers who shaped Springfield individual voices behind the show. The Simpsons is not a single authorial voice. It has never been. Across 36 seasons and hundreds of episodes, it has been the product of a specific and evolving collection of individual sensibilities, each writer bringing a distinct comedic register, a distinct set of cultural references, a distinct understanding of what the show was and what it could be. The cumulative voice that the audience experiences as the unified voice of the show is, in reality, a texture woven from dozens of individual voices over decades, and understanding the specific contributions of the most significant individual writers reveals something important about why the show sounds the way it does, and why the sound changes so noticeably across different periods. John Swartzwelder is the figure who dominates any honest discussion of individual Simpsons writers, not only because of his episode count, 59 episodes across 13 years, but because of the specific quality his episodes possess, a quality recognizable on first viewing and difficult to precisely articulate. Swartzwelder's episodes have a density of idea per unit of time that exceeds even the show's generally high standard. His plots do not simply develop in the conventional sense of one thing following from another. They accelerate, with each scene producing consequences that the next scene immediately escalates, creating a narrative momentum that makes his episodes feel like they are moving faster than 22 minutes allows. His treatment of Homer is distinctive in a specific way that reveals something important about his understanding of the character. Swartzwelder's Homer is simultaneously the most stupid and the most strangely wise version of the character in the show's history. He operates by a kind of absurd internal logic that has its own consistency even when it produces results that no rational process would generate. The episodes where Homer pursues a scheme of spectacular implausibility, following each step with complete conviction, and somehow arrives at an outcome that is both unexpected and perfectly suited to the character, are disproportionately Swartzwelder's episodes. His working method was unusual enough to become part of the show's mythology. He preferred to write alone rather than in the collaborative writer's room environment that produced most of the show's scripts. He submitted scripts that were closer to finished than most first drafts, requiring less rewriting from the room. He worked on a typewriter. He was not present for many of the production meetings that other writers attended as a matter of course. These are not the habits of a television writer in the conventional sense. They are the habits of a novelist who happens to be working in a television format. His departure from the show in the early 2000s was as quiet as his working style, conducted without significant public statement and without the kind of industry gossip that usually accompanies a high-profile departure. He subsequently began writing a series of comic novels, self-published with a deliberately minimal public profile, that have attracted a devoted readership drawn largely from people who loved his Simpsons episodes and recognized in the novels the same deadpan comic precision. He has given very few interviews and has declined most requests for them. He is the most private major contributor to one of the most publicly discussed creative properties in television history, and the contrast between his institutional significance and his personal obscurity is itself a kind of Swartzwelder joke. Greg Daniels joined the show's writing staff in the early 90s and contributed some of the most celebrated episodes in the show's history before leaving to pursue other projects. His understanding of character psychology was unusually precise, and his episodes tend to be the ones that the show's most emotionally affecting moments come from. The episodes where Homer does something unambiguously terrible and then is brought face to face with the consequences of that terribleness in a way that the character cannot deflect or avoid are disproportionately Daniels's. He had a gift for finding the specific emotional core of a situation and building a story that approached that core without either sentimentalizing it or evading it through comedy. His departure from The Simpsons was not the loss from the show's perspective that it might have been, because the projects he pursued after leaving produced creative work of comparable quality. His involvement in the American version of The Office and in Parks and Recreation demonstrated that the specific gifts he brought to The Simpsons were not show-specific, but were transferable qualities of storytelling that served different material equally well. David Silverman's contribution to the show exists in a different register from the writers, because Silverman was a director rather than a writer, but his influence on what the show looks like and how the animation serves the comedy is fundamental enough to belong in any serious account of the individual voices that shaped Springfield. Silverman directed some of the most celebrated episodes in the show's history and established visual approaches to the show's comedy that influenced how every subsequent director understood what the show's animation could do. His understanding of timing and animation was specific and precise in ways that are not easily conveyed in words, but that are immediately visible in the difference between a scene that is funny and the same scene with the timing slightly adjusted that is not funny at all. The specific duration of a pause before a reaction shot, the precise moment when a character's expression changes, the exact speed of a physical movement that makes it comic rather than neutral. These are the elements that distinguish Simpsons animation at its best. From animation that is technically competent but comedically inert, and Silverman understood and applied these distinctions with unusual mastery. Mike Reiss and Al Jean, who ran the show together during the third and fourth seasons and who are responsible for many of the episodes that appear most frequently on best-of lists, brought a specific kind of literate comedy sensibility to the room that reflected their shared background in American humor writing. Their episodes tend to have a density of reference and a quality of verbal precision that rewards rewatching, not because jokes are hidden, but because the jokes are constructed with enough precision that they reward attention to the specific words chosen. The difference between a good joke and the same joke with one word changed is sometimes the difference between a joke that stays with you and one that you forget immediately, and Reiss and Jean were unusually consistent in choosing the right words. George Meyer's contribution to the show is one of the most discussed among the writers themselves, and one of the least known to general audiences. Meyer, who joined the show in the third season and remained for many years, is frequently cited by fellow writers as the person most responsible for the specific quality of darkness beneath the comedy that distinguishes the show's best episodes. His sensibility tended toward the bleak in ways that were carefully managed by the production to remain on the right side of the line between genuinely funny and merely depressing, and the management of that tension is itself one of the show's characteristic achievements. He was known in the room for finding the joke that nobody else had found, the angle on a situation that was more uncomfortable or more unexpected or more precisely targeted than anything the room had generated through its more conventional pitching process. His contributions were not always accepted because the most surprising angles are also the riskiest ones, and the room did not always have the appetite for the specific risk that Meyer's best ideas required. But when his contributions were accepted and made it into episodes, they were frequently the moments that people remembered years later as the best in the episode, the moments that made the show feel like it was doing something that television was not supposed to be able to do. The collective of female writers who contributed to the show across different periods has been the subject of increasing critical attention as the conversation about gender representation in writers' rooms has expanded. The Simpsons' early seasons were produced primarily by male writers, reflecting the gender composition of television comedy writing rooms of that era. The female writers who did contribute in those early years navigated a specific kind of creative environment that the available accounts describe in terms ranging from competitive to actively hostile. The specific creative contributions of those writers, the episodes and storylines and character moments that emerged from their presence in the room, have not always been fully credited in the public account of the show's history, partly because the writing staff credit is collective rather than individual for most episodes, and partly because the stories told about the room's culture have tended to focus on the experiences of the majority rather than on the specific experiences of those who navigated a different set of conditions within the same environment. The transition between generations of writers across the show's history is one of its most significant, ongoing creative dynamics. The writers who joined the room in the show's first seasons had a specific experience of the show's foundational period that shaped their understanding of what the show could be. The writers who joined in the show's 10th season came into an established institution with its own culture, its own habits, its own accumulated understanding of what worked and what did not. The writers who join the room now are entering an institution with 36 years of history behind it, a history that is simultaneously a resource and a constraint. What this generational succession means for the show's creative identity is not easy to evaluate, because the relevant standard, The thing you would compare each era's output to in order to assess whether it represents progress or decline is itself contested. The early seasons are the reference standard for most critics and fans, but the early seasons were themselves a specific creative moment that could not have been sustained indefinitely regardless of who was in the room, because the specific conditions that produced them, the founding creative energy, the specific ensemble that formed around the Bible's principles, the culture of disciplined ambition that Sam Simon had established, were conditions of a specific historical moment rather than permanent features of the show's production environment. Number section 12. The show that shaped the world, Springfield's cultural legacy. The Simpsons began as a television show and became something larger than any single medium can contain. It is a cultural institution now, one of the most extensively analyzed, most widely referenced, most deeply embedded pieces of narrative entertainment in American history. The specific ways in which it embedded itself in American culture, and through American culture in the global culture that American entertainment has long dominated, are worth examining carefully because they reveal something true about how culture actually works, about how stories enter the shared imagination of a civilization and change what that imagination can picture. The show's influence on subsequent animation is the most directly traceable element of its cultural legacy. Before The Simpsons, primetime animation in America was a genre that had essentially not existed since the Flintstones ended in 1966. The Simpsons did not just revive the genre, it defined it in ways that persist to the present. The specific approach to animated comedy that the show established, the combination of character-based story and satirical observation of American life delivered through adult characters in a suburban setting, with a specific visual style that was simultaneously simplified and expressive, became the template that the most successful animated shows of the subsequent 3 decades worked from or against. Beavis and Butthead, Family Guy, King of the Hill, South Park, Futurama, Bob's Burgers, Archer, and dozens of other animated programs that have appeared since 1989 all exist in a landscape that The Simpsons created. Some of them, particularly Family Guy in its early seasons and South Park across its entire run, are as much arguments with The Simpsons as they are shows in their own right, defining their identities partly through explicit opposition to what The Simpsons had established as norms for the genre. But the argument is itself a form of inheritance. You can only argue with something that matters enough to argue with. Matt Stone and Trey Parker, the creators of South Park, have been explicit about this in multiple interviews over the years. South Park is built on an understanding of what The Simpsons had done and a deliberate decision about what to do differently. The choice to maintain genuine topicality, producing episodes that engage with events happening in the same week as their broadcast, was a decision made in conscious response to The Simpsons' floating timeline and its increasingly limited engagement with current events. The choice to commit to permanent consequences, to allow events in one episode to affect subsequent episodes, was a response to The Simpsons' reset button. The argument with The Simpsons is visible in South Park's structure. The show's influence on American comedy writing extends well beyond animation. The specific kind of comedy that The Simpsons produced, dense with reference, with built-on character, willing to find genuine emotion in absurd situations without losing its comic identity, became an aspiration for a generation of comedy writers across every medium. Writers who grew up watching the show's early seasons and who then went into comedy writing in various forms have consistently cited it as a formative influence on their understanding of what comedy could do. The show was not just popular, it was educational. It demonstrated a set of possibilities for the comedy form that expanded what writers understood the form to permit. The show's relationship to American political culture is more complex than its liberal reputation suggests. The show has a genuine satirical record that spans every presidential administration, from Reagan to the present, and that record is more even-handed than partisans on either side would prefer. The show has been consistently skeptical of political authority, consistently suspicious of institutional power, and consistently interested in the gap between the promises that democratic institutions make and the experiences of ordinary people navigating those institutions. These are not specifically liberal values. They are values that a certain kind of democratic populism, with roots in American political culture that predate the modern left-right divide, has always held. The show's consistent return to the theme of ordinary people being exploited by powerful institutions, Whether those institutions are corporations like the nuclear plant, or governmental like Springfield's perpetually corrupt municipal government, or social like the various clubs and organizations that Springfield's citizens form and disband, reflects a worldview that is suspicious of concentrated power in general rather than specifically hostile to any particular political formation. This suspicion has made the show useful to critics across the political spectrum, who have each found in it support for their own specific critiques, and has made it genuinely difficult to characterize as simply liberal or simply conservative in its underlying politics. The prediction phenomenon, which has made the show more famous in the 2010s and 2020s than it was during its actual golden age, deserves extended treatment because the phenomenon reveals something important about how the show has been received and about how confirmation bias operates in the information environment of social media. The show predicted Trump's presidency. The show predicted various technological developments. The show predicted various specific events and trends. These claims circulate continuously on social media, each new apparent prediction generating another cycle of attention to the show and to the specific episode that apparently foresaw the future. The honest account of this phenomenon is considerably less mystical than the social media version suggests. The show has produced nearly 800 episodes over 36 years. Each episode contains dozens of jokes, references, and satirical observations about the trajectory of American culture, technology, politics, and society. When you generate that volume of content over that length of time, some of it will align with future events through statistical probability. The television writers and producers who have addressed this directly have consistently made exactly this point. Volume plus time plus confirmation bias produces the appearance of prediction without requiring any actual predictive capacity. The Trump episode is the most discussed case and the most instructive one. The episode from the year 2000 that depicted a President Trump was not based on a mystical insight into the future. It was based on an observation about the direction of American political culture that was available to any attentive observer in 2000, that celebrity status was increasingly important in American politics, that Trump had been publicly flirting with presidential ambitions for more than a decade, that the logical endpoint of celebrity politics was a celebrity president. The episode made a joke about the logical endpoint of a visible trend. The logical endpoint then occurred. The episode's apparent prediction is the result of careful cultural observation, not prophecy. The elements of the phenomenon that remain genuinely surprising are the ones where the specific detail of an alignment is precise enough that statistical probability alone feels inadequate as an explanation. These cases are rare, and they require honest examination rather than either dismissal or mystification. The most intellectually honest position is that some of the show's apparent predictions reflect genuine insight into cultural trajectories that were already visible at the time of writing. Some reflect the specific density of content that probability alone produces, and some remain genuinely surprising in ways that neither explanation fully accounts for. The show's influence on the specific texture of American humor, on the specific way that Americans now make jokes and process comedic situations, is the element of its cultural legacy that is most pervasive and least visible. The Simpsons has been in American cultural life since before most of its current audience was born. Its jokes have become part of the general vocabulary. Its observations have become part of the general understanding. Its specific way of finding the joke in a situation, through reference, through character, through the application of a satirical intelligence to an ordinary moment, has been so widely absorbed that it is now invisible as influence because it has become the baseline expectation for a certain kind of comedy. The internet meme culture that developed in the 2000s and became dominant in the 2010s is partly a Simpsons product. The specific format of using a screenshot from a specific episode to comment on a general situation, which was one of the foundational formats of internet meme culture, was available as a format because the show had produced enough content across enough subjects and situations that a relevant screenshot existed for almost any point a person might want to make. The show's breadth and depth, the sheer volume of its engagement with American culture over 36 years, made it the perfect source material for a culture that communicated through juxtaposition and reference. Springfield has become, in a specific sense, a real place. Not geographically, not on any map, but culturally. It exists in the shared imagination of millions of people who have spent hundreds of hours there across the years of watching the show. They know its streets and its buildings and its residents and its history. They know its specific logic and its specific irrationality. They know it in the specific way that you know a place you have spent significant time, which is to say, more thoroughly than you know most places you have only visited, and less thoroughly than you know your own home, but with a quality of familiarity that has its own kind of reality. This is the show's deepest achievement and its strangest one. It created a place. Not a fictional setting, which is what every story creates, but an actual cultural location, a place that exists in the minds of its audience with enough specificity and enough consistency to constitute a genuine shared reality. When two Simpsons fans meet and begin talking about the show, they are not exchanging opinions about a piece of entertainment. They are talking about a place they have both been, comparing their knowledge of a location they share, the way that people who have both lived in a particular city compare their memories of its streets and neighborhoods. That is The Simpsons. That is what 36 years of a television show can produce when the television show is trying to do something more than entertain, when it is trying to build a world rather than just populate one. Springfield was built. It was built carefully, and then carelessly, and then carefully again, by hundreds of people over 3.5 decades, and it stands now as one of the most fully realized fictional locations in the history of narrative. It is not real, but it is there, and everyone who has ever watched the show knows exactly where there is. Number section 13. The music of Springfield. Everything you never knew about how the show sounds. The sound of The Simpsons is as distinctive as its look, and the story of how that sound was created, developed, and maintained across 36 seasons is one of the show's most under-examined production histories. Most viewers experience the show's music as background, as the atmospheric layer beneath the dialogue and action, as something that registers subconsciously without demanding attention. But the music is doing specific and important work in every scene, and the system that produces it, the specific creative and institutional arrangements that have kept Springfield's savory sonic world consistent across hundreds of episodes and dozens of production years, is more interesting and more complicated than casual listening suggests. Danny Elfman's theme is the obvious starting point, because it is the piece of music most firmly associated with the show in the public consciousness, and because its creation story reveals something important about the speed and instinct at which creative decisions sometimes need to be made. Elfman was hired to compose the theme for the show's pilot season on the basis of his work on the Pee Wee Herman film and on Tim Burton's Batman, which had established him as a composer with a specific gift for music that was simultaneously playful and slightly ominous, whimsical in its surface presentation and darker in its emotional texture. He composed the theme in a single session, working quickly enough that what he delivered was essentially the version that aired, without significant revision. The specific qualities that make the theme immediately recognizable, the interval structure of the opening notes, the specific instrumentation that combines orchestral sweep with cartoonish punching energy, the way the melody moves between major and minor tonalities within a few bars, all of these were the product of a few hours of composition rather than extended development. What this tells you is that some creative decisions are the result of extended deliberation, and some are the result of a practiced intuition recognizing exactly what a situation requires, and Elfman's relationship to this commission was the second kind. The theme's status as one of the most recognized pieces of music in television history has been achieved without the kind of saturation marketing that most television themes depend on for recognition. The Simpsons theme has never been released as a commercial single, has never been featured prominently in advertising, has never been promoted as a standalone piece of music. It is recognized simply because it plays at the beginning of every episode of one of the most widely watched television programs in history, and the specific quality of the music, the fact that it lodges in memory after a small number of hearings, has done the rest. Alf Clausen composed the underscore for the show for 27 seasons, from the first season through the 27th, and his contribution to the show's sonic identity is fundamental in ways that are not fully appreciated because underscore does its most important work invisibly. Clausen approached each episode as a specific compositional problem, writing new music tailored to the specific emotional and comic needs of each scene, rather than relying on a library of stock musical phrases applied generically to standard situations. This approach was more expensive and more labor-intensive than the alternative, and it produced a more musically specific result, because the music in each scene was composed to serve that specific scene's specific function. His musical vocabulary for the show was unusually broad, encompassing references to classical music, jazz, big band, musical theater, film score traditions, and the specific idioms of cartoon music that had been developed across decades of animation. The show's willingness to deploy these references directly, to play a moment against a specifically recognizable musical reference in ways that commented on the moment through the gap between the musical expectation the reference creates and the actual content of the scene, was a comic resource that Clausen understood and used with considerable craft. His departure from the show after the 27th season, replaced by a different compositional approach, was a change that dedicated listeners could hear in the subsequent episodes. The specific character of the show's musical underscore has been different since Clausen's departure, not better or worse in any absolute sense, but different in ways that reflect a different compositional sensibility approaching the same material. The songs within episodes are a distinct category from the underscore, and they have their own production history that reveals something interesting about the show's creative culture. The Simpsons has produced an extraordinary number of original songs over its history, songs performed by characters within the show's world, rather than songs playing over scenes as underscore. These range from the elaborately staged musical numbers in episodes that specifically feature performance as a plot element, to the shorter, more throwaway songs that characters sing in moments of celebration or commentary. The musical numbers in the Simpsons movie deserve specific attention because they represent the most sustained musical set piece the show has ever attempted in a single production. The movie's production scale allowed for musical moments that the weekly episode format could not have accommodated, and the songs that appear in the movie were developed with a specific understanding that they needed to carry more narrative and emotional weight than a typical episode song. The collaboration between the show's regular musical team and composers, brought in specifically for the movie's production, created a hybrid approach that served the movie's specific needs while remaining recognizable as part of the show's established musical world. The Barbershop Quartet episode, in which Homer joins and then breaks up and then reunites a barbershop quartet, is the most fully developed musical episode in the show's history before the movie and remains one of the more ambitious things the show has attempted musically. The episode required original compositions in the specific barbershop idiom, performed with enough musical precision to be convincing as barbershop, while also being funny in the specific ways the show's comedy required. The voice actor's ability to perform this music was not something that had been tested in previous episodes at this level, and the production process for the musical content was more complicated than anything the show had previously attempted in an episode format. The specific use of music to punctuate or comment on comedy is one of the areas where The Simpsons' musical production most clearly distinguishes itself from the standard cartoon approach. The standard approach uses musical stingers, short punching musical phrases, to underline joke punchlines. The Simpsons uses this approach too, but it also uses music in more sophisticated ways, allowing music to create ironic distance between what is happening visually and what the sound world suggests is happening, or to extend a comedic moment into a different emotional register by sustaining a musical phrase beyond the point where the visual joke has resolved. The show's relationship to licensed popular music is another dimension of its musical production that has produced specific legal and creative challenges. When an episode's story requires a recognizable piece of popular music, either as something a character is listening to, or as music playing in a setting, or as something referenced explicitly in dialogue, the licensing requirements are substantial and the negotiations are sometimes complex. The fees for licensing popular music for television have increased significantly over the course of the show's history, reflecting both inflation and the increasing understanding among music rights holders of the value that appears on a major network program. The creative decision of when to use a recognized piece of music, with its associated licensing cost, versus when to commission an original piece in a similar style, which is cheaper but produces a less immediate recognition response in the audience, is one that the show's producers have navigated throughout its history. The decisions made in this navigation are not always visible in the finished episodes, because a convincing pastiche of a musical style can do the same comic work as the original without the licensing cost, but they shape the sonic character of specific scenes in ways that dedicated listeners can hear. The sound design of the show, which is distinct from the music but equally important to the sonic experience, is another under-examined production element. The specific sounds of Springfield, the Homer scream, the specific quality of ambient noise in the power plant, the sounds of the various locations that recur across episodes, constitute a sonic world that is as consistent and as carefully maintained as the visual world. The sound library that the show has built across 36 years is extensive, and the specific sound choices made for recurring elements of the show have become as recognizable as its visual equivalents. The voice performances, which are the most visible element of the show's sound production, operate in relationship to all of these other sonic elements in ways that the ensemble recording process makes particularly coherent. When Castellaneta performs Homer in the recording booth, he is performing in a sonic context that includes the music, the sound design, and the performances of the other cast members, and the result is a voice performance that is integrated into the show's sound world in ways that individually recorded performances cannot fully achieve. The coherence of the show's sonic world is partly an achievement of talent and partly an achievement of the specific production choices that kept the talent working together. Number, Section 14. The technical evolution from hand-drawn cells to digital Springfield. The technical history of how The Simpsons was actually made, frame by frame and season by season, is one of the most complete records available of how animation production changed across the transition from traditional to digital tools. The show ran long enough that it began in one technical era and has continued through multiple subsequent eras, adapting to each new technical context while maintaining enough visual continuity that the show's identity remained recognizable across the transition. The cell animation process that produced the show's first 13 seasons was the culmination of a tradition that had been developing since the early days of the animation industry. Transparent plastic sheets, called cells, were painted with the opaque colors that would appear in the finished frames, and then photographed against separately painted background art to create the composite image. Each second of animation required 24 individual cells, though the actual production rarely used full 24 frames per second, instead using techniques like holding on a single drawing for multiple frames or cycling repeated motion that reduced the total number of unique drawings required while maintaining the illusion of fluid movement. The production volume that this process required was enormous. An episode of 22 minutes required roughly 15,000 to 20,000 individual drawings, each one executed by hand by animators who had been trained to replicate the show's specific character models with enough consistency that the variation between drawings was below the threshold of perceptibility when the drawings were assembled into motion. The Korean animation studios that executed this work during the show's first 2 decades maintained a workforce of skilled animators whose specific expertise was in replicating The Simpsons' visual style, and the quality of their replication improved consistently across the years of their involvement. The background art had its own parallel production process. Where the character animation was produced in Korea, the background paintings were produced in Los Angeles by a department dedicated to creating the specific visual environments of Springfield. The backgrounds needed to be consistent with the established visual record of the show's recurring locations, while also being specific enough to the needs of individual scenes to support the action happening in front of them. The art department maintained an extensive visual library of established locations, from which background artists could draw reference for consistency, while also creating new environments for the specific scenes that required them. The transition to digital production that began during the show's 14th and 15th seasons was not a single event but a gradual process of tool replacement as individual elements of the production pipeline were converted from traditional to digital methods. The earliest digital tools were adopted in the coloring department, where filling cells with paint was replaced by filling digital drawings with color using software tools that were faster and more precise than hand-painted originals. The line work remained hand-drawn for longer, because the specific quality of a drawn line, its variation in weight and character, was considered an important element of the show's visual identity that digital tools of the period could not fully replicate. The shift to fully digital animation, when it came, changed the visual quality of the show in ways that are visible if you know to look for them, and that many longtime viewers feel without being able to articulate. Digital lines are more precise and more consistent than hand-drawn ones, which is both an advantage and a change from the show's established visual character. Digital coloring produces more saturated and more stable color fields, without the slight variation in tone that physical paint application produced. The backgrounds in the digital era have a different relationship to the characters moving in front of them, partly because both are now digital objects rather than a digital character composite over a physical painting. The high-definition conversion that happened during the show's 20th season involved not just a technical upgrade, but a visual redesign. The existing character models and background designs had been created for a 4:3 aspect ratio, the standard for analog television, and the transition to the 16:9 widescreen aspect ratio required rethinking how scenes were composed and how existing visual designs needed to be adjusted to work in the new format. The production made these adjustments while maintaining enough visual continuity that casual viewers did not experience the conversion as a jarring change, but dedicated viewers can see the differences in how the show's visual space is organized before and after the conversion. The current digital production pipeline that the show uses is fully integrated in ways that earlier digital tools were not. Scripts are written digitally, shared digitally, revised digitally. Storyboards are digital. The animatic is digital. The animation is digital from initial drawing through final composite. The sound production, including voice recording, music, and sound design, is digital throughout. The result is a production environment that is faster and more flexible than the cell-era process, capable of revisions and corrections at stages of production, where the cell process would have required expensive reshoots or simply accepted errors that were discovered too late to fix. The flexibility of digital production has changed the relationship between the animatic and the final product in specific ways. In the cell era, significant divergence between the animatic and the final animation was expensive and therefore rare. The animatic was a commitment as much as a guide, because changing it in the animation stage required redoing work that had already been completed. In the digital era, the relationship between the animatic and the final product is more fluid, because digital tools allow changes to be made further into the production process at lower cost. The show uses this flexibility differently in different contexts, sometimes maintaining close fidelity to the animatic, and sometimes using the digital tools to make improvements that the animatic stage had not anticipated. The visual quality control that the show maintains across its digital production is managed through a combination of automated tools and human review, with the character models serving as the reference standard against which individual frames are evaluated. The models themselves are maintained as digital documents that define the exact specifications of each character's appearance, from the precise geometry of their proportions to the specific color values of their skin and clothing. The precision of these specifications is considerably higher than was achievable through the character sheet system that cell animation used, and the consistency of character appearance across episodes has improved as a result. Number. Section 15. The secondary characters. The forgotten people of Springfield. Springfield is not just the Simpson family. It is a populated world, a community of hundreds of recurring and incidental characters who have been developed to varying degrees across the show's 36 seasons, each one representing a specific creative investment in the idea that the town around the main family is as real and specific as the family itself. The secondary characters of Springfield are one of the show's greatest achievements and one of its most significant ongoing creative challenges, because maintaining the consistency and the humanity of a large cast over decades of production is genuinely hard, and the show has not always succeeded at it. The most developed secondary character in the show's history is almost certainly Ned Flanders, who began as a straightforward comic device, the impossibly virtuous neighbor against whom Homer's failures are measured, and who was gradually revealed to be one of the most psychologically complex characters in the show's world. The moment of revelation, which comes in the episode dealing with the hurricane that destroys Ned's house, is one of the more dramatically significant turning points in the show's character history. Ned's breakdown in that episode, his expression of the rage and despair that his performance of perfect goodness had been suppressing, revealed that the niceness was not a character trait but a psychological cage, a defense mechanism built around a genuinely difficult personality through years of behavioral therapy in childhood. The show does not sentimentalize this revelation or resolve it quickly. It allows it to be genuinely disturbing. The discovery that the most apparently decent person in Springfield is decent, not through character, but through conditioning. That the goodness is a performed response to early intervention, rather than an authentic expression of who he is. This revelation transforms every previous Flanders appearance retroactively. The patience he displayed through dozens of interactions with Homer was not saintly. It was pathological. The forgiveness he offered after Maud's death was not grace. It was a programmed response from a man whose brain was wired against expressing the anger that was the most authentic thing about him. The show, in revealing this backstory, acknowledged that it had been depicting something more complicated than it had appeared to be depicting, that the comedy of Ned's virtue had a darker interior than the surface presented. The Barney Gumble arc represents a different kind of secondary character complexity. Barney began as a very specific comic type, the town drunk, a figure whose entire existence was defined by his relationship to alcohol in ways that were played primarily for comedy, without much concern for the reality that the comedy was based on. He was funny. He was reliably funny. And the show's early relationship to his alcoholism was essentially comic, without being uncomfortable in the way that the later season's more honest engagements with the subject sometimes were. The episode in which Barney gets sober, in which his character's defining trait is removed and he has to navigate who he is without it, is one of the more honest treatments of alcoholism that a primetime comedy has attempted. The episode does not resolve the problem sentimentally. It acknowledges that sobriety is not simply the absence of drinking but a continuous active negotiation with the conditions that made drinking appealing, and it acknowledges that the person who emerges from sobriety is not necessarily the person who existed before the alcohol, because the alcohol had become so integrated into the character's sense of self that removing it required building a new self rather than recovering an old one. Apu Nahasapi Mapetilon's history is the most publicly contested secondary character story in the show's history, because the criticism that eventually led to the character's retirement from the show raised questions not just about this specific character, but about the broader creative ethics of the show's approach to representing communities that were not represented in the writer's room. The character was voiced by a white performer doing an Indian accent. The character's portrayal drew on stereotypical associations that Indian Americans found reductive and occasionally offensive. These facts were not new in 2017 when the controversy became public. They had been present in the character from his first appearance. What changed in 2017 was the public context in which the character's portrayal was being evaluated. A documentary made specifically to examine the character's impact on Indian American identity brought the critical conversation into a public space that it had not previously occupied at the same volume. The show's initial response to the controversy was insufficiently engaged, treating the criticism as a matter of misunderstanding rather than as a genuine problem with the character's design that deserved serious consideration. The eventual retirement of the character, in which Hank Azaria stopped voicing Apu and the character essentially disappeared from the show, represented a belated acknowledgement that the criticism had substance. Chief Wiggum's specific charm as a secondary character comes from the gap between his institutional role and his actual capabilities. He is the chief of police in a town that requires policing, and his incompetence at this role is the source of the comedy. But the most interesting Wiggum episodes are the ones that complicate the incompetence, the episodes that suggest that Wiggum's failure at his job is not simply a matter of stupidity, but is also a matter of the specific institutional culture of Springfield's police department and the specific economic and social conditions that make competent policing in Springfield genuinely difficult even for someone better suited to the role. Sideshow Bob's arc across 12 appearances is the most elaborately developed recurring villain story in the show's history, and the specific challenge it faced was maintaining dramatic tension across a premise that the audience understood completely by the second or third iteration. Everyone watching a Sideshow Bob episode knows that Bob will not succeed in killing Bart, because the show cannot kill its own protagonist. The dramatic question that the premise requires, whether Bob will succeed, is not actually open. The episodes have to find their tension elsewhere, in the specific comedy of the situation, in the character work around Bob's specific psychology, in the increasingly elaborate scenarios that the writers constructed to justify another Bob story. The episodes where this challenge was met most successfully are the ones that found genuinely new things to explore within the premise. The episode where the Terwilliger family is revealed and Bob's genetic context is examined. The episodes where Bob interacts with other major characters in ways that reveal new aspects of his psychology. The episode where Bob is released from prison and attempts to live a legitimate life, which examines what the character would actually be like if his obsession with revenge were removed and only his genuine qualities remained. The Hans Moleman character is one of the show's most interesting secondary figures, precisely because he appears to be the simplest. a recurring background character whose defining characteristic is his apparent vulnerability to disaster. He gets hurt, he gets killed. He reappears in the next episode unhurt, ready to be hurt again. The comedy is entirely in the repetition and escalation, in the show's willingness to treat the suffering of this specific elderly man as an ongoing source of comic variation. What makes him more interesting than this surface suggests is a single line of dialogue in an episode where he identifies his age as 31. He is clearly not 31 in any visual sense. Whatever he has experienced in his life, whatever Springfield has done to him, has aged him catastrophically beyond his biological years. He is, if you take this line seriously, a young man who has been destroyed by his environment, a person whose outside does not match his inside in ways that the show never addresses directly, because addressing them directly would transform the comedy into something much darker than the show is prepared to sustain. The secondary characters of Springfield taken as a group represent something important about the show's artistic ambition in its best years. The belief that everyone in the world of the story mattered, that the people in the background were people rather than props, that the joke about a character whose only function was to receive punishment was less interesting than the implied story about who that character actually was and how they had ended up in the specific position of being the person who always takes the punishment. Springfield's secondary characters are the show arguing with its own comic conventions, finding in the corners of its world a humanity that the comedy at the center does not always have space for. Section 16. The Network Wars, Fox, The Simpsons, and 36 Years of Creative Tension. The relationship between The Simpsons and the Fox Broadcasting Company is one of the most unusual and most generative creative institutional relationships in the history of American commercial television. The show made Fox, not in the sense that Fox would not have existed without it, because Fox was already a functioning broadcast network before The Simpsons premiered, but in the specific sense that Fox's identity as a network, its reputation for edginess, its willingness to program material that the three major networks would not program, was defined in the public imagination primarily through The Simpsons in a way that preceded and enabled everything else Fox subsequently became. Fox launched in 1986, 3 years before The Simpsons premiered. In those 3 years, the network had established itself as a struggling fourth option, a network that existed but that had not yet found the programming that would give it a reason to exist in the eyes of the audience. It had some promising shows, it had some audience, but it did not yet have a show that defined it, that told viewers what Fox was and why they should watch it rather than the three networks that had been there longer and had more resources. The Simpsons was that show. When the show premiered in December of 1989 and immediately began generating cultural conversation, it did something for Fox that money could not have bought directly. It gave the network a creative identity. Fox was the network that aired The Simpsons. The Simpsons was edgy and smart and willing to say things that other networks would not say. Therefore, Fox was edgy and smart and willing to say things that other networks would not say. The show's creative identity became the network's brand identity, and that brand identity attracted other shows and other viewers who wanted what the brand promised. This dynamic created a specific tension in the creative relationship between the show and the network. The show had given Fox its identity, and the show's creative freedom was the source of the identity it had given. A Fox that constrained The Simpsons was a Fox that was betraying the brand that The Simpsons had created for it. This gave the show's creative team a specific kind of leverage that most network shows do not possess, the leverage of being the source of the brand rather than merely an expression of it. The show used this leverage in specific and documented ways over the years. When the network's Standards and Practices Department flagged content as potentially problematic, the show's producers could point to the show's brand value as a reason to resolve the tension in favor of the content rather than against it. When the network wanted to exploit the show commercially in ways the creative team found inappropriate, the creative team could argue that commercial exploitation that undermined the show's credibility would ultimately damage the brand that the show had created. The argument was not always made explicitly in these terms, but the implicit understanding that the show's value to the network depended on its creative integrity was a force that shaped every negotiation between the two parties. The network's ownership changed in a way that affected this dynamic significantly when Rupert Murdoch sold most of Fox's entertainment assets to Disney in 2019. The Simpsons, along with the rest of the Fox Entertainment catalog, became part of the Disney intellectual property portfolio, which is itself one of the larger concentrations of entertainment intellectual property in commercial history. The specific institutional culture of Disney, which is considerably more protective of its brands and its creative properties than Fox had historically been, created a new context for the show's ongoing production. The show's satirical treatment of Disney itself became an immediate point of interest following the acquisition. The Simpsons had satirized Disney across multiple episodes over the years, because Disney is one of the most culturally significant corporate entities in American entertainment, and therefore one of the most obvious targets for a show that satirized cultural and corporate power. After the acquisition, the show continued to make jokes about Disney. The jokes were observed and discussed with more attention than previous Disney jokes had received, because the situation, a show satirizing the corporation that owned it, was genuinely unusual. The network's scheduling decisions have affected the show's history in specific ways that are worth examining. The specific time slot in which a show airs shapes its audience in ways that go beyond simple reach, because different time slots attract different viewing demographics and different viewing contexts. The Simpsons has aired in the same general Sunday evening time slot for most of its history, a slot that has defined its audience as family inclusive in ways that a later night slot would not have. The Sunday evening context, following football in many markets during the fall season, has given the show access to a broad audience that a different scheduling position might not have reached. The network's approach to the show's international distribution has evolved significantly across the 36 years, as the international television market itself has evolved from a context where domestic American shows were exported to foreign broadcasters to a context where streaming platforms have created genuinely global release structures. The show's international distribution is now managed within Disney's streaming infrastructure, which gives it access to audiences in markets where the show's broadcast history was limited or absent, and creates a context for the show's back catalog to reach audiences for whom it is genuinely new rather than a familiar. Cultural reference. The creative friction between the network's commercial interests and the show's creative ambitions has been documented across enough specific instances to constitute a genuine pattern. The network wanted more episodes than the production could consistently sustain at high quality. The production wanted to control the scheduling of episodes in ways that the network's overall programming needs sometimes complicated. The network wanted promotional content and appearances from the cast that the cast sometimes found onerous. The production wanted creative latitude that the network's standards and practices functioned sometimes complicated. Each specific instance of this friction has been resolved in specific ways, through negotiation and compromise, and occasionally through the kind of principled refusal that is only available to a show whose value to the network is great enough to make the cost of antagonizing its producers more expensive than the cost of accommodating their concerns. The accumulation of these specific resolutions across 36 years has produced a creative institutional relationship that is unlike any other in television history, because no other creative institutional relationship has had this specific combination of parties, this specific history, and this specific duration in which to develop its specific character. Number Section 17. What the show got wrong and why those mistakes matter. Every long-running show accumulates failures. Decisions that seemed reasonable at the time and that look different in retrospect. Episodes that the production team would approach differently now. Character choices that led down roads that turned out to be dead ends. Tonal mistakes that undercut the show's credibility in ways that took multiple seasons to repair. The Simpsons has more of these than most shows, partly because it has been running long enough to accumulate a larger history than most, and partly because the creative risks it took in its best years were genuine risks, and genuine risks produced genuine failures alongside genuine successes. The most discussed failure in the show's history is the period of quality decline that most critics and dedicated fans locate somewhere in the late 90s through the early 2000s. The specific episodes cited as evidence of this decline tend to have certain qualities in common: a reliance on plot over character, a tendency to let Homer's behavior become cruel rather than merely misguided, a looseness in the joke structure that allows setups to go unresolved and punchlines to arrive without the precision that the show's best comedy requires, and a tendency to substitute shock or absurdity for the kind of character-grounded comedy that had defined the early seasons. The Homer cruelty problem is worth examining specifically because it represents a genuinely significant artistic mistake rather than simply a quality decline. In the early seasons, Homer's behavior that damaged other people was almost always the unintended consequence of his good intentions and his poor judgment. He caused harm without meaning to, and the comedy of his failures was the comedy of a person who is trying, imperfectly, to navigate a world that does not always accommodate his specific combination of ambition and capability. The harm was real, but the intention was not malicious, and this distinction was what made Homer sympathetic enough to sustain the audience's affection across years of watching him fail. In the period of the show that critics identify as the quality decline, Homer's behavior toward other characters, particularly toward Marge and toward his friends, becomes harder to read as the unintended consequence of good intentions. He does things that are recognizably selfish rather than well-intentioned but misguided. He makes choices that the audience can see are choices, rather than the impulsive decisions that overwhelm his better judgment. The comedy of these choices is less generous than the comedy of the earlier failure pattern, because it is no longer asking the audience to sympathize with a person trying and failing, but to laugh at a person making bad decisions that they could make differently. The show recognized this problem and made explicit efforts to correct it at various points, most notably in the statement by various showrunners during the Al Jean era that they were actively trying to return Homer to the character he had been in the early seasons. These efforts have been partially successful. Specific episodes in the Jean era genuinely recapture the quality of character-based comedy that had defined the early seasons. But the effort to recover a character that has drifted requires working against years of accumulated drift, and the drift has not been fully corrected across the board. The Sideshow Bob repetition problem is a different kind of failure, one that results not from a character going wrong, but from a premise being used past the point of its productivity. The first several Bob episodes are excellent. They find genuine dramatic and comic tension in the premise, and they explore Bob's psychology with a specificity that makes him one of the show's most interesting characters. But the premise, a villain who repeatedly tries to kill the protagonist and repeatedly fails, has a structural ceiling. Once the audience fully understands the structure of every Bob episode, the episodes have to work harder and harder to justify their existence within a framework that the audience can see through completely. The show's solution to this problem, to escalate the scenarios in ways that placed Bob in increasingly extreme situations, produced some genuinely inventive episodes and also produced some that felt desperate in the sense of having run out of internally motivated reasons to tell another Bob story. The Bob episode where he joins a traveling circus is inventive. The Bob episode where he and Bart find themselves on the same island and form an unlikely friendship is genuinely surprising in its emotional territory. But there are also Bob episodes that exist primarily because Bob is commercially valuable as a recurring character, and not because the specific story the episode tells needed to be told. The show's treatment of the passage of time, or rather its refusal to treat the passage of time honestly, is a creative failure that the show has never resolved, and that has become more visible and more consequential as the years have accumulated. In the early seasons, the floating timeline was a barely perceptible convention because the gap between the show's actual age and the characters' apparent ages was small enough to feel manageable. By the show's 20th season, the gap had become genuinely strange. By the 30th, it is one of the more surreal aspects of watching the show. This family in a perpetual present that has now lasted longer than the actual childhoods of most of the people watching them. The floating timeline prevents the show from doing things that would make it more interesting and more honest to the actual experience of family life. The children cannot grow up. The parents cannot age into a different relationship with their lives and with each other. The stories that the show could tell if it allowed time to pass, stories about parents watching children leave home, about couples renegotiating their relationship as the circumstances that defined it change, about the specific experience of growing older in a world that changes around you, are stories the show has foreclosed by maintaining the permanent present. The show's relationship with its own mythology is another area where creative failure is visible. The show established, across its best seasons, a specific understanding of its own world that it occasionally violates in later seasons in ways that are visible as violations rather than as creative development. The specific economic situation of the Simpson family, established so carefully in the early seasons, is regularly ignored in later episodes that give Homer access to resources his established situation does not explain. The specific geography of Springfield, developed in the early seasons with enough consistency to feel like a real place, is increasingly inconsistent in later seasons, in ways that go beyond the deliberate ambiguity the Bible had established. These failures matter because they are evidence of something real about the show's institutional condition. The people who built the show's world with the most care, who understood the specific rules they had established and the reasons those rules existed, are no longer the people primarily responsible for the show's ongoing production. The mistakes are not arbitrary. They are the specific mistakes that result from an institution continuing past the point where the institutional knowledge that gave it its specific character is fully present in the room. The show's failures, taken as a whole, are inseparable from its ambitions. A show that only attempted what it could reliably execute would have fewer failures and would also be less interesting. The failures of The Simpsons are the failures of a creative institution that consistently tried to do things that were difficult, that took risks that did not always pay off, that pursued a vision of what animated comedy could be, that the conventional expectations of the form would not have generated. The failures are the price of the ambition, and the ambition produced enough genuine achievement that the failures are a manageable cost. The specific failures also illuminate the specific achievements by contrast. You understand how good the best episodes are partly through understanding how different they are from the worst ones. The gap between a Swartzwelder episode from the 5th season and a filler episode from the 18th is the gap between a show fully realizing its own potential and a show running below its own standards, and understanding both ends of that gap is understanding something true about what the show has been and what it could be. The failures were not inevitable. They were the results of specific decisions made under specific pressures at specific moments in the show's history, and the decisions could have been different. That they were not is part of the show's honest record, and the honest record is more interesting than any version that only acknowledges the successes. Number. Final section. Springfield Forever. Why this show endures. 4 hours is a long time to spend in one place, and Springfield has earned it. Everything covered across these sections. The Bible and the lost episodes, the voice performances and the writer's room, the merchandise and the foreign adaptations and the legal battles and the near endings and the technical history and the cultural legacy and the honest accounting of the failures alongside the achievements, all of it points toward a single question that is harder to answer than it should be. It is the question that every piece of long-running entertainment eventually forces on the audience that has lived with it long enough. What does this thing actually mean to us? And why does it mean that? And what does the fact that it means that tell us about who we are and what we need from the stories we choose to spend our time inside? The Simpsons is one of the few pieces of entertainment in history that genuinely earns that question, that has been around long enough and has done enough genuine creative work that the question is not rhetorical but real. And the answer is different for every person who has watched the show, because the show is different things to different people, in exactly the way that any genuinely rich creative work is different things to different people, yielding different returns to different kinds of attention brought to it at different moments in a life. Why does this show endure? Not just why does it continue to be produced, which is a commercial question with a commercial answer. Why does it continue to matter? To the people who have been watching it for 30 years, and to the people who are encountering it for the first time right now. Why does Springfield remain a destination worth visiting, a place worth spending time in, a world worth caring about? The honest answer is that the show endures because it got something right about human experience that most entertainment does not get right, and that the thing it got right is fundamental enough to sustain 3.5 decades of audience relationship. It got right that ordinary life, the life of a middle-class family in an ordinary town, is simultaneously ridiculous and deeply serious. That the small stakes of a family's daily existence, the argument about money, the child's embarrassment at school, the marriage tested by accumulated frustration, the job that is never quite right, are the stakes that actually matter to the people living them, regardless of how small they look from outside. The show understood that Homer's desire to be appreciated by his family is as genuine and as urgent as any epic motivation in any story that pretends to be about more important things. It understood that Marge's patience has a cost that is real, and that the cost matters. It understood that Bart's rebellion is not just mischief, but the authentic expression of a specific intelligence in a specific environment that does not know what to do with it. It understood that Lisa's intelligence is not a gift but a condition, something she did not choose and cannot turn off, and that creates specific and real difficulties in her specific and real world. These understandings produce the early season's specific quality of comedy that is also somehow true, that makes you laugh and also makes you feel that you have recognized something. The recognition is the thing. The show at its best creates moments of recognition that are both funny and genuinely illuminating, moments where the gap between how things are supposed to work and how they actually work is made visible through the specific lens of these characters in this world. The show endures also because Springfield is a real place, in the sense that matters. Real enough to remember, real enough to return to, real enough to feel like you have been away from somewhere specific when you have not watched in a while. This realness is the product of the care that went into building Springfield across the show's best years. The care for the secondary characters, the care for the spatial and social consistency of the town, the care for the specific texture of a community that the Bible had mandated and that the best writers honored. The show will end. Everything ends. Every generation of viewers adds their own layer to the show's meaning, finding in the same episodes and the same characters something specific to their own time and their own circumstances, something that the episode did not know it was saying when it was written, but that turns out to be exactly what needed to be said. That is the deepest thing a work of narrative art can do. Speak to people it was not made for, in moments it could not have anticipated, with a precision that feels personal even when it is universal. When it does, the ending will not make Springfield less real. The episodes will still be there, 36 seasons of them, and the Springfield they document will still be accessible to anyone who wants to visit. The show's cultural legacy, already substantial, will continue to grow as the audience that grew up with it grows older, and the audience that discovers it for the first time becomes the audience that has always known it. The specific experience of watching The Simpsons for the first time, of encountering Homer and Marge and Bart and Lisa and Maggie without already knowing them, is now available only to children and to people who have made a deliberate choice to avoid one of the most ubiquitous cultural products in modern history. For everyone else, the show exists in a particular relationship with memory, which is the relationship of something that was there before you fully understood what it was, that has been part of your cultural environment for as long as you can remember, that carries the specific weight of things encountered in childhood or adolescence, when the capacity for forming lasting attachments to stories and characters is at its highest. The show is not just a television show for most of its audience. It is a piece of their autobiography. It is also a show whose faults and failures are documented with the same completeness as its achievements, because it ran long enough for both to accumulate into a full and honest record. The Springfield that exists in that imagination is as real as any place that has never existed can be, which is to say, real enough to matter, real enough to return to, real enough to carry through a life as one of the reference points against which other experiences are measured. What the show leaves behind is not just a body of episodes. It is a model for what animated television can be when it is trying to be something more than entertainment. It is a demonstration that a cartoon family in a cartoon town can be taken seriously as a subject for genuine creative investment without losing the comedy that makes taking them seriously enjoyable. It is evidence that the ordinary, the domestic, the small-scale human experience of regular people navigating the specific conditions of their lives is as worthy of sustained artistic attention as any subject that presents itself as more grand. The loop keeps running. The family keeps living their specific version of an ordinary life in a town that cannot be found on any map and that everyone who has ever watched the show knows exactly where to find. And somewhere in that contradiction, in the thing that is impossible and is also absolutely real, is the thing that makes the show what it is. The thing that 36 seasons have not been able to exhaust, and that the remaining seasons, however many there are unlikely to exhaust either. Springfield is forever, not because the show will literally run forever, but because the place that the show built in the imagination of its audience has the quality of permanence that only the most deeply inhabited fictional worlds achieve. It will still be there when the show stops. It will still be there when the people who built it are gone. It will still be there because the audience put it there, in the specific part of the mind where the things that shaped you live, and that part of the mind does not empty out easily. That is The Simpsons, all of it, the things you knew and the things you did not. the things that got made and the things that got lost. The voices and the animation and the music and the merchandise and the legal battles and the near endings and the arguments about quality and the 36 years of Sunday nights. All of it in service of a family in a yellow house on a street in a town that is nowhere and everywhere, doing ordinary things in extraordinary ways, for an audience that keeps coming back because the show, at its best, is telling them something true. The characters who have lived in Springfield since 1989 have been, for the duration of that time, the longest continuously running fictional family in American television history. They have witnessed, and in their specific cartoon way participated in, every cultural and political and technological shift of the last 4 decades. They have been present for the end of the Cold War and the rise of the internet and the September attacks and the financial crisis and the pandemic and every election and every cultural moment that has shaped the world the audience, watching them inhabits. They have done all of this without aging, without changing in any fundamental way, without ever quite acknowledging the passage of time that has accumulated around their frozen existence. That is the specific strangeness of The Simpsons, the thing that sets it apart from every other long-running show in television history. It is a time capsule that keeps getting filled with new time, a frozen moment that keeps moving forward. And the audience keeps watching, because the family in the frozen moment feels more real, more consistent, more reliably themselves than most of what the moving world outside Springfield has to offer. The show's relationship with time is the thing that will define its historical legacy more than any other quality. No other work of narrative entertainment has maintained a continuous present tense across 4 decades. No other story has been told in real time for this long, updating its cultural references and its topical observations while freezing its characters in the same moment they inhabited when the story began. This is not just a formal curiosity. It is an unprecedented artistic achievement, whatever one thinks of the specific episodes that constitute it. The Simpsons has done something that no other story in human history has done, and the doing of it, the maintenance of that continuous present across 36 years of changing world, is itself worthy of the sustained attention it has received. The show's relationship with its audience has also been shaped by the specific social media environment that developed during the later part of its run. The Simpsons fandom online is one of the most active and most analytically sophisticated fandoms in television history, producing detailed episode analyses, production histories, voice actor retrospectives, and ongoing quality debates that rival in depth and seriousness the academic literature on canonical works of literature. The show has earned this level of attention not just through longevity but through the specific quality of the work that made the longevity matter. A show that had run for 36 years without producing anything of lasting value would not have generated a fandom of this seriousness. The seriousness of the fandom is itself evidence of the seriousness of the work. The next time Bart writes something on that chalkboard, or Homer reaches through the television for his donut, or Lisa plays her saxophone in that bedroom window, look a little more carefully than you did before. There is more there than there used to be, because now you know where to look for it. Good night.